Hi guys, struggling to drift off to sleep, forget counting sheep, immerse yourself in the surprisingly tranquil and fascinating world of ancient Roman emperors' secret gardens. Discover the soothing sounds and intriguing stories behind these forgotten green sanctuaries designed to lull you into a restful night's sleep while expanding your historical knowledge. Before we start, likes and subscribes help me keep making these. Where are you listening from? Drop your city and time in the comments. I'm always reading them thinking, wait, people in New York listen to history stories to sleep. Okay, tonight we are talking about the Roman Emperor's secret gardens. But before we go anywhere, get cozy. Pillows good? Blanket situation handled? Perfect. Trust me on this one. You're lying there, probably staring at your phone screen in the dark, wondering if ancient Rome is really going to put you to sleep tonight. Spoiler alert, it absolutely is. Because we're not talking about battles or senators stabbing each other in togas. We're talking about gardens. Specifically, the kind of gardens that Roman emperors built when they had unlimited money, unlimited labour, and unlimited time to worry about whether their roses were the right shade of pink. So here's the thing about ancient Rome that nobody really tells you. Yes, they built aqueducts, and conquered half the known world, and invented concrete that's somehow still better than what we use today. But they also spent an absolutely ridiculous amount of time thinking about plants. Not just any plants. Exotic, expensive, nearly impossible to keep alive plants that had to be shipped from Egypt or Persia, or some mountain range that doesn't even have a name anymore. And they built gardens that would make modern landscapers weep with envy, and probably also frustration, because how do you even irrigate a hillside garden in 100 AD without electricity? You hire about 300 people apparently, that's how. The gardens we're talking about weren't the kind you'd find in some suburban backyard, complete with a slightly depressing bird bath and maybe some tomatoes that never quite ripen. These were massive, sprawling estates hidden behind palace walls, complete with artificial grottos, imported marble statuary and water features that defied every law of physics known to ancient engineering. Emperors didn't just walk through these gardens, they held court in them. They made life-altering decisions under the shade of carefully pruned cypress trees. They probably lay on couches eating grapes while servants fanned them with palm fronds, which sounds absurd until you realise that's exactly what they did. And the best part? Most people had no idea these gardens even existed. While the average Roman citizen was dealing with the noise and the smell and the absolute chaos of city life. Packed into insulae apartment buildings that were basically ancient fire hazards, emperors were strolling through perfumed pathways lined with rose bushes that had been bred specifically to bloom in the wrong season. It's the kind of luxury that's almost offensive in its extravagance, except it's also weirdly beautiful. Because someone at some point decided that the most powerful person in the world should be surrounded by flowers, not weapons, not gold statues of themselves, though there were probably a few of those too. But flowers. You have to imagine what it must have felt like to walk into one of these spaces after spending hours in the forum, dealing with senators and petitions and the constant background hum of a city that never quite slept. The air would change first. Cooler. Softer. The sound of running water would replace the sound of voices and cartwheels on stone. And then you'd see it. Rows of perfectly trimmed hedges, flowering vines climbing marble columns, fountains that somehow shot water 15 feet into the air without a single electric pump. It was another world, built inside the world, and it was yours. All yours, at least until the Praetorian Guard decided they'd had enough of you and installed someone else. But we're not thinking about that right now. What's fascinating is how these gardens were kept secret. Not in the sense that nobody knew they existed, but in the sense that very few people ever actually saw them. Ancient writers mention them in passing, usually in the context of describing an emperor's wealth or eccentricity, but they don't go into detail. There are no blueprints, no gardener's journals detailing which plants went where or how often the fountains needed maintenance, just fragments. A line here, a reference there, and then centuries of silence as the gardens fell into ruin, buried under dirt and time, and the weight of an empire that eventually collapsed in on itself. Archaeologists have spent decades trying to piece together what these spaces actually looked like, and honestly, they're still guessing. Which makes the whole thing even more mysterious and therefore even better for a story like this, told in the dark while you're trying to convince your brain to stop thinking about tomorrow's meetings. So, tonight, we're going back. Not to the Rome you learned about in school, with its wars and its emperors and its fascinatingly horrifying public executions. We're going to the quiet parts, the green parts. The parts where the only sound was water and wind, and maybe, if you were lucky, the distant song of a bird that had been imported from somewhere impossibly far away, just so an emperor could hear something beautiful. Let's start with the moment someone realised these gardens were even there. You're an archaeologist, probably sometime in the early 1900s, standing in what used to be Rome but is now just a field on the edge of the city. Someone's building a new apartment complex or a train station or something equally modern and practical, and they've hired you to make sure they're not about to bulldoze through something historically significant, which, in Rome, is basically every square inch of dirt. You're expecting the usual broken pottery, maybe part of an old wall, the kind of thing you catalogue and photograph and then let the construction crew pave over anyway because, let's be real, there's only so much ancient Roman infrastructure one city can preserve. But then someone digs a little deeper, and instead of hitting more stone or clay, they hit something else. Soil that's different, richer, darker. The kind of soil that's been carefully cultivated and composted and maintained for years, maybe centuries. And mixed in with that soil, they find seeds, pollen, root systems that have somehow, miraculously, survived 2,000 years underground. It doesn't look like much at first. Just dirt and plant matter, the kind of thing that would be easy to dismiss if you didn't know what you were looking at. But you do know what you're looking at, because you've spent years studying ancient Rome, and you know that this kind of soil doesn't just happen, it's deliberate. Which means that at some point, someone went to an enormous amount of trouble to bring this soil here, probably from miles away, and then used it to grow something that required very specific conditions. Something expensive, something that screamed, "I have so much money I can afford to import dirt." And then you find the pipes. Not the big obvious aqueduct kind that everybody knows about. Smaller pipes. Lead pipes mostly, though some are made of terracotta, snaking through the ground in patterns that suggest a level of planning and precision that's almost unsettling. These aren't random, they're part of a system. A network designed to carry water from a central source out to dozens, maybe hundreds of different points across a wide area. You trace one pipe and find the remains of a fountain basin. You trace another and find what might have been a reflecting pool. A third leads to a spot where the soil is especially rich, and you realise you're standing in what used to be a flower bed. It takes months, sometimes years, to map out the full extent of what you've found. Because the garden, if that's what it is, doesn't follow any kind of logic that makes sense to modern sensibilities. It's not symmetrical, it doesn't have clear borders. Instead, it sprawls and curves and doubles back on itself, like whoever designed it cared more about creating specific views and experiences than about making something neat and organised. Which, when you think about it, makes perfect sense, because this wasn't a public park. It wasn't meant to be efficient. It was meant to be beautiful, and maybe a little bit overwhelming. You start finding other things. Fragments of marble statues, most of them too broken to identify but clearly expensive. Pieces of mosaic tile that suggest there were once pathways decorated with intricate patterns, probably depicting scenes from mythology or nature. And everywhere, there's evidence of water. Channels carved into stone, drainage systems that would have prevented flooding, cisterns that could hold thousands of gallons, ensuring that even during the dry summer months the fountains kept flowing and the plants stayed green. The scale of it starts to sink in, and it's kind of staggering, because what you're looking at isn't just a garden, it's an engineering project on par with some of Rome's most famous structures, except instead of building something designed to last forever, someone built something designed to be temporary. Gardens don't last, plants die, water dries up, stone cracks and pathways get overgrown, and within a generation or two, if nobody maintains it, the whole thing disappears. Which means that whoever built this knew it wouldn't last, and they did it anyway. You imagine the conversations that must have taken place. Some emperor, probably lounging on a couch somewhere, casually mentioning that he'd like a garden. Not just any garden, a garden that rivals the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, even though by this point those gardens are already ancient history and probably mythical. His architects and engineers exchange nervous glances because they know what's coming. They know they're about to spend the next 5 years of their lives figuring out how to make water flow uphill and how to keep palm trees alive in a climate that's absolutely not meant for palm trees. But they also know they don't have a choice, because when an emperor wants a garden, you build him a garden, even if it's completely, utterly, gloriously impractical. And so they do. They bring in soil from Egypt. They import plants from Syria and North Africa and the far edges of the empire. They build fountains that require constant maintenance and plant trees that will take decades to mature, long after this particular emperor is dead and forgotten. Because that's the thing about imperial gardens. They're not really about the person who commissions them. They're about the idea of permanence, even though nothing about them is permanent at all. You're standing in one of these gardens now, or at least the version of it that existed around 80 AD. during the reign of an emperor whose name you might remember from history class, but probably associate more with violence than with horticulture. The sun is setting, which is the best time to be in a Roman garden, because the afternoon heat has finally broken, and everything is bathed in that golden light that makes even ordinary things look extraordinary. Except nothing here is ordinary. The first thing that hits you is the smell. Not flowers, not yet. Water. Clean water, which in ancient Rome is actually kind of a luxury even if you're rich, because the city itself smells like a combination of fish markets, human waste, and whatever questionable things are being cooked in the street-side food stalls. But here, behind these walls, the air smells like nothing. Or rather, it smells like earth and stone and the faint mineral scent of water that's been running through lead pipes. It's clean in a way that makes you realise how dirty everything else is. You follow a pathway made of fitted stone, each piece cut so precisely that you can barely see the seams between them. The path curves gently to the left, and you can't see what's around the corner, which is intentional. Roman garden designers understood something about anticipation, about the way a hidden view is always more interesting than an obvious one. They wanted you to walk slowly, to discover each section as you moved through it, rather than being able to stand at the entrance and see everything at once. Around the corner you find the first fountain. It's not huge, not one of those overwhelming multi-tiered affairs that you'll find deeper in the garden. This one is almost modest, just a simple stone basin with water bubbling up from the centre and spilling over the edges into a channel that runs along the side of the path. But even this small fountain required an incredible amount of planning. The water has to come from somewhere, probably an aqueduct that's been diverted specifically to feed this garden. It has to flow at the right pressure, not so fast that it splashes everywhere and wastes water, but not so slow that it just sits there looking sad and stagnant. Someone spent hours, maybe days, adjusting the pipes and the angles until the flow was exactly right. You kneel down and put your hand in the water, and it's cold. Genuinely cold. The kind of cold that can only come from underground sources, or from water that's been moving quickly enough through stone channels that it hasn't had time to warm up. In the summer heat, this would have been incredibly refreshing. You can imagine slaves or servants standing here, filling cups for their masters, or maybe just cooling their own hands and faces when nobody was looking. Past the fountain, the garden opens up into a wider space, and this is where you start to see the plants. They're arranged in beds that follow the same curving logic as the pathways, creating little pockets and alcoves that feel separate from each other, even though they're all part of the same overall design. Closest to you are roses, which you recognise immediately, even though these aren't quite like modern roses. These are smaller, with fewer petals, and they bloom in shades of deep pink and white. The Romans were obsessed with roses. They used them for everything. Wreaths, perfumes, decorations at banquets. They'd scatter rose petals on floors and float them in wine. During some festivals, they'd apparently release so many rose petals from the ceiling of banquet halls that guests would nearly suffocate under the weight of them, which is either incredibly decadent or incredibly stupid, depending on how you look at it. Beyond the roses, you see plants that have no business being in Rome. Date palms, which are native to North Africa and the Middle East. Bay laurels, which technically can grow in Italy, but these ones are massive, clearly decades old, which means someone planted them long before this particular emperor came to power, and just hoped they'd still be alive whenever the garden was completed. There are myrtles and oleanders and something that might be a cypress or might be some other conifer that's been imported from gods nowhere. Every single one of these plants represents a small fortune in transportation costs alone. Someone had to dig them up, pack their roots carefully, keep them watered during a journey that might have taken weeks or months, and then replant them here, knowing that many of them probably wouldn't survive the transplant. But enough of them did survive, clearly, because you're standing in the middle of what is essentially a botanical collection that spans the entire Roman Empire. It's showing off, basically. A very expensive, very elaborate way of saying, look what I can do, look what I can make grow in a place where it shouldn't grow. And the thing is, it works. Even now, 2,000 years later, when all that's left are root systems and pollen samples, it's still impressive. You walk further in, and the sound of water gets louder. Not just one fountain now, but several, all operating at once. The Romans understood something about water sounds that modern landscape designers sometimes forget, that moving water isn't just visually appealing, it's also psychologically calming. The constant soft rush of it covers up other noises, creates a kind of white noise that makes it easier to think, or, alternatively, to stop thinking entirely. In a city as loud as Rome, where you could hear your neighbours through the walls of your insula and street vendors started shouting before dawn, this must have felt like stepping into a different world. The paths keep branching, keep offering choices, and you take the one that leads upward because you can see that the garden is built on multiple levels, terraced into a hillside in a way that must have required an absolutely absurd amount of earth moving. Romans were good at earth moving. They had enslaved people, and they had engineering knowledge, and they had a cultural belief that nature was something to be conquered and reshaped according to human will. So when an emperor said he wanted a garden on a hill, they didn't suggest maybe building it on flat ground instead. They just started digging. The terrace you're climbing toward is supported by a retaining wall made of stone blocks, each one probably weighing several hundred pounds. The wall is designed to look natural, or at least as natural as a massive stone structure can look, with plants growing out of crevices and vines trailing down the face of it. At regular intervals there are small openings in the wall, and water trickles out of them, running down the stone and collecting in channels that direct it to the level below. It's decorative, yes, but it's also functional. The water helps cool the air, creates pleasant sounds, and prevents the wall from becoming just a big blank slab of stone. You reach the top of the terrace and stop, because the view from here is genuinely breathtaking. You can see the entire garden spread out below you, the winding paths, the clusters of plants, the multiple fountains all operating in some kind of coordinated system that must require constant attention from a staff of maintenance workers. Beyond the garden walls, you can see the city, Rome itself, sprawling and chaotic and smoky, with the red tile roofs of thousands of buildings stretching toward the horizon. The contrast is almost jarring. Out there, noise, crowds, the constant struggle of daily life in an overcrowded ancient metropolis. In here, calculated tranquility, carefully curated beauty, the kind of peace that only money can buy. On this terrace there are more exotic plants. You see what might be a lemon tree, though citrus fruits are still relatively new to Rome at this point in history, rare and expensive enough that most people will never taste them. There are also plants you can't immediately identify, things with strange leaf shapes and unusual growth patterns that suggest they come from climates very different from Italy. Someone, probably the head gardener if such a position existed, would have had to learn the specific needs of each of these plants. How much water, how much sun, what kind of soil, and they would have had to teach that knowledge to others, because gardens like this require a small army of workers to maintain. You're trying to imagine what that job would have been like, being responsible for keeping alive a collection of plants worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime, when you notice the pavilion. It's set back from the edge of the terrace, partially hidden by a carefully arranged screen of laurels and myrtles. The structure is open-sided, with a roof supported by columns that are carved from white marble. The floor is mosaic, and even though you're seeing it in the fading evening light, you can tell that the pattern is intricate, geometric designs interspersed with images of birds and flowers, and possibly mythological scenes, though it's hard to make out the details from where you're standing. This is where the emperor would have come to actually use the garden, to sit and think, or talk, or just exist in a space that was removed from the demands of rule. The pavilion is furnished simply a few couches, a small table, everything arranged to take advantage of the view. There are no walls, nothing to block the breeze or the sight lines. From here you can see both the garden and the city, can be reminded simultaneously of the beauty you've created and the empire you control. You sit on one of the couches, which is more comfortable than you expected. The cushions are stuffed with something soft, possibly wool or down, and covered in fabric that's been dyed a deep purple. Purple dye, you remember, comes from sea snails and costs an absolute fortune. Only emperors and the very wealthiest citizens are allowed to wear it. Having purple cushions in a garden pavilion is the kind of casual luxury that would have made visitors understand exactly who they were dealing with. From here, in the growing darkness, you can start to see lights appearing in the garden below. Oil lamps, probably, placed strategically along the paths and near the fountains. They don't provide much illumination, not compared to modern lighting, but they create pools of warm golden light that make the garden look even more magical than it does during the day. The Romans knew how to use light and shadow, understood that sometimes the suggestion of something is more powerful than seeing it clearly. You can hear voices now, distant and indistinct, servants probably, lighting more lamps and preparing the garden for whatever evening activities the emperor has planned. Maybe there will be a dinner party, with guests reclining on couches that will be carried out to various spots throughout the garden, eating elaborate courses while musicians play and the fountains provide background ambiance. Or maybe the emperor wants to be alone, to walk the paths in silence and think about whatever impossible problems emperors think about, wars and succession, and whether the grain supply from Egypt is going to arrive on time this year. The air is cooling rapidly now that the sun is fully set, and you pull an imaginary cloak tighter around your shoulders. Even in summer, Roman nights could get chilly, especially up on a terrace where the breeze flowed freely. But it's a pleasant kind of cold, the kind that makes you appreciate warmth when you find it. Somewhere below there's probably a brazier being lit, coals glowing red and radiating heat that will keep the emperor comfortable if he decides to stay out here after dark. You stand up and walk to the edge of the terrace, looking down at the garden one more time. In the lamplight, it looks like something from a dream, unreal, too beautiful to be sustainable, which of course it wasn't. Gardens like this require constant maintenance, constant attention, constant money. The moment any of those things disappear, nature starts taking back what humans built. Weeds creep in, fountains clog, stone cracks and pathways become overgrown. Within a generation or two of neglect, all of this would be gone, buried and forgotten. But right now, in this moment that you're imagining, it's perfect. You descend from the terrace using a different set of stairs, these ones carved directly into the hillside and bordered by more of those low retaining walls that seem to exist as much for aesthetic purposes as structural ones. The steps are shallow and wide, designed for leisurely walking rather than efficient movement. Every few steps there's a small landing where someone could pause and look at a particular plant or fountain or piece of statuary. The Romans didn't believe in hurrying through their gardens. The whole point was to slow down, to move at a pace that allowed you to actually notice things. At the bottom of the stairs you find yourself in a section of the garden that's more densely planted than the areas you've seen so far. The paths here are narrower, bordered by hedges that have been trimmed into precise geometric shapes, box hedges probably, which the Romans loved because they could be shaped and maintained, and they stayed green year-round. Between the hedges there are flower beds filled with plants that bloom at different times of the year, ensuring that there's always something colourful to look at. Right now, in late summer, you see what might be marigolds or some ancient relative of them, along with various herbs that are probably as much for practical use as decoration. Romans didn't separate ornamental plants from useful ones the way we do now. If something was beautiful and edible or medicinal, that was even better. So mixed in with the purely decorative flowers, you find lavender and rosemary and what might be fennel, all of them filling the air with complicated overlapping scents that change as you walk past. The combination is almost overwhelming, but not quite. Someone with a very good nose, probably that same head gardener you imagined earlier, figured out exactly which plants to put next to each other for maximum olfactory impact without crossing the line into sensory overload. You follow the path as it winds between the hedges, occasionally opening up into small clearings where there's a bench or a small fountain, or just an arrangement of plants that's particularly striking. This part of the garden feels more intimate than the terraces, more like a series of outdoor rooms than a single large space. Each clearing has its own character, its own mood. One features a statue of Venus rising from a shell-shaped basin, water flowing around her marble feet. Another has nothing but herbs and a simple stone bench positioned to catch the last rays of evening sun. A third contains a small reflecting pool so still that you can see the sky mirrored perfectly in its surface. The reflecting pool is interesting because it's not moving water, which means it's not part of the main fountain system. Someone has to clean this regularly, or it would quickly become stagnant and filled with algae and mosquito larvae. But when it's maintained properly, like it clearly is now, it creates this perfectly smooth mirror that doubles whatever is above it. Right now, that's the darkening sky and the first few stars, but during the day it would reflect clouds and birds and the overhanging branches of nearby trees. The Romans were big on reflection, both literal and metaphorical. They liked surfaces that showed them versions of reality that were the same but different, familiar but transformed. You crouch next to the pool and look at your reflection, which is barely visible in the dim light. The water is cold when you touch it, probably fed by the same underground sources as the fountains. A few flower petals float on the surface, rose petals that have either fallen naturally or been scattered deliberately. You're not sure which. Both seem equally plausible in a garden where every detail appears to be carefully considered. Moving on, the path takes you to a structure that's larger and more enclosed than the pavilion on the terrace. This is actually a building, though calling it that seems too utilitarian for what it is. It's more like a garden room, a space that's technically indoors but designed to feel as much like outdoors as possible. The walls are made of stone, but they're covered in frescoes depicting garden scenes, so even when you're looking at a wall you're looking at painted plants and birds and fountains. The ceiling is partially open to the sky in the centre, creating an atrium effect where rain can fall into a central basin and be collected for the garden's water system. The room is furnished with more of those purple cushioned couches, arranged in a semicircle around the central basin. There are small tables between the couches, probably for holding cups and plates during the dinner parties you imagined earlier. The floor here is also mosaic, but much more elaborate than what you saw in the pavilion. This one depicts the 4 seasons as female figures, each surrounded by the plants and activities associated with their particular time of year. Spring has flowers and birds, summer has grain and fruit, autumn has grapes and hunting scenes, winter has bare trees and what looks like a figure warming themselves by a fire. The mosaic is stunning, and you spend several minutes just walking around it, looking at the details. Each figure's face is slightly different, suggesting they might have been modelled on real people rather than generic ideals. The tiles are tiny, hundreds of them used to create each square foot of image, all cut and placed by hand with a precision that seems impossible. This floor alone probably took months to complete, and it's just one element of one room in a garden complex that includes dozens of similar spaces. You're starting to understand something about the scale of labor involved in creating and maintaining a place like this. It's not just the gardeners, though there must be many of those. It's also the engineers who keep the water systems functioning, the craftspeople who repair broken statuary and cracked tiles, the slaves who clean the reflecting pools and sweep the paths and light the evening lamps. An operation like this probably employed hundreds of people, all working to create an illusion of effortless natural beauty that's actually the result of constant human intervention. Beyond the garden room, the paths open up again into what appears to be a more utilitarian section of the property, though utilitarian is relative when you're dealing with an imperial estate. Here you find the greenhouses, or at least the Roman equivalent of greenhouses. They're not glass because the Romans didn't have glass in large enough sheets to build proper greenhouses. Instead, they've constructed buildings with walls made of thin sheets of mica or selenite, translucent materials that let light through while still providing protection from wind and cold. Inside one of these structures, you find plants that are even more exotic than what's growing outside. These are species that can't survive outdoors in Rome even during the summer, things that need constant warmth and carefully controlled humidity. There are palms that are smaller than the ones outside, probably younger specimens being cultivated until they're large enough to transplant. There are also plants with huge broad leaves that you don't recognize at all, possibly from India or even further east. The air in here is humid and warm, almost uncomfortably so, and you can hear water dripping constantly from some kind of irrigation system rigged up in the ceiling. The technology here is impressive. The Romans have figured out how to create a microclimate inside a building, maintaining conditions that are completely different from what's happening outside. During winter, there are probably braziers keeping the space warm, with slaves assigned to tend them constantly to ensure the temperature never drops too low. During summer, the mica panels can be opened or covered with cloth to regulate how much sun gets in. It's primitive compared to modern climate control, but it works well enough to keep these impossible plants alive thousands of miles from their native habitats. Next to the greenhouse, there's a work area where you can see the tools and materials used for garden maintenance. Clay pots in various sizes are stacked in neat rows, waiting to be used for transplanting or forcing bulbs. There are pruning shears made of bronze, surprisingly sharp and well-maintained. Baskets for collecting flowers or fruit or cuttings. What looks like a primitive wheelbarrow, though the wheel is solid wood rather than the spoke design that won't be invented for several more centuries. Everything is organized and clean, suggesting that someone takes their job as garden manager very seriously. There are also bags and containers holding various substances used for soil amendment and fertilization. The Romans understood that plants need nutrients, even if they didn't understand the chemistry of why. So they collected compost, animal manure, wood ash, even ground up bones and fish heads. Anything that seemed to make plants grow better got saved and mixed into the soil. The smell here is earthy and organic, not entirely pleasant but not terrible either. It's the smell of things decomposing and becoming other things, the fundamental transformation that makes gardens possible. You're examining a container of what might be imported fertilizer from Egypt, where the Nile's annual floods create incredibly rich soil, when you hear footsteps approaching. For a moment you tense, remembering that you're imagining yourself in a private imperial garden where you absolutely do not have permission to be. But the footsteps pass by without pausing, and you catch a glimpse of a figure carrying an oil lamp, probably making evening rounds to check on the plants and make sure nothing needs immediate attention. This reminds you that gardens like this never sleep, not really. There's always something that needs doing. A fountain that started to clog, a plant that's showing signs of disease or pest damage, a pathway that needs sweeping. During the day there are probably dozens of workers moving through the space, though they're likely trained to be as unobtrusive as possible so they don't disturb the emperor or his guests. At night, the staff is smaller but someone always needs to be present in case of problems. You leave the work area and follow another path, this one leading away from the main garden toward what sounds like running water. Not fountain water this time, something larger, more natural sounding. After a few minutes of walking through an area that's been allowed to grow slightly wild, probably deliberately so to create a transition between the manicured garden and whatever comes next, you emerge at the edge of a stream. This is interesting because you know there's no natural stream that flows through this part of Rome, which means this is artificial, a water feature on a scale that makes the fountains look modest by comparison. Someone has diverted a portion of an aqueduct, channeled it through the property, and created what looks and sounds exactly like a natural stream, complete with rocks and small waterfalls, and even fish swimming in the deeper pools. The engineering required to make this happen, to create the right flow rate and prevent erosion and maintain water quality must have been extraordinarily complex. You follow the stream upward, toward its source, and find that it originates from a grotto carved into the hillside. The grotto is artificial, obviously, but it's been made to look as natural as possible, with irregular stone walls covered in moss and ferns and water seeping out from multiple points to create the impression of a natural spring. Inside the grotto, which is lit by more of those ubiquitous oil lamps, there are more frescoes, these ones depicting water nymphs and river gods and various mythological scenes related to water and nature. The grotto is cool and slightly damp, a perfect retreat during the heat of summer. There's a stone bench inside where someone could sit and enjoy the sound of falling water while being hidden from view. It's the kind of place that's designed for solitude or intimate conversations, somewhere you could go to escape even from the rest of the garden. The Romans understood the value of having spaces within spaces, layers of privacy that allowed for different degrees of withdrawal from public life. You sit in the grotto for a while, listening to the water and letting your eyes adjust to the dimmer light. The temperature difference is noticeable even on a summer evening. In here, with the stone walls holding on to the coolness of the earth and the constant presence of water, it feels almost cold. You can imagine what this would be like at midday in August when Rome is absolutely baking under the sun and even the garden paths are hot enough to feel through sandal leather. This would be the perfect escape, a place where you could sit and feel almost chilled while the rest of the city suffered. The frescoes are harder to see in the lamplight, but you can make out enough detail to appreciate the skill involved. One wall shows a scene of nymphs bathing in a forest pool, their bodies painted with remarkable attention to anatomy and movement. Another depicts Neptune riding through waves that seem to have actual depth, despite being completely flat paint on stone. The colours are still vivid, blues and greens and flesh tones that haven't faded much despite the humidity and time. Roman painters knew what they were doing with pigments, knew which ones would last and which would need protection or regular touching up. There's graffiti scratched into one corner of the grotto, which surprises you until you remember that Romans graffitied everything. Walls, floors, monuments, nothing was sacred. This particular message is in Latin, obviously, and it says something about Marcus and Julia, and a date that corresponds to about 15 years after this garden was supposedly built. You wonder if Marcus and Julia were slaves who worked here, or aristocratic lovers who snuck away for privacy, or just random people who somehow gained access and wanted to leave their mark. The grotto doesn't provide any answers. You leave the cool darkness of the grotto and step back out into the evening air, which feels warm now by comparison even though the temperature has dropped considerably since sunset. The path along the stream continues downward, and you follow it, watching the water tumble over carefully placed rocks that create small waterfalls and rapids. Every so often, there's a deeper pool where the water slows and collects before continuing its journey. Some of these pools contain fish, you notice. Not just any fish, but what look like ornamental varieties, probably imported at considerable expense from somewhere in the east where people had been breeding fish for colour and pattern for centuries. The stream eventually leads you to a larger pond, this one big enough that calling it a pond seems inadequate. It's more like a small lake, maybe 50 feet across at its widest point, with an irregular shoreline that includes several small promontories and inlets. In the centre of the pond there's an island, and on that island there's a pavilion, similar to the one you saw on the terrace but smaller and more intimate. The only way to reach it is by a narrow bridge that's barely wide enough for one person, making it clear that this is meant to be a private space, somewhere the emperor could go to be truly alone. The water in the pond is remarkably clear, and even in the fading light you can see down to the bottom in the shallow areas near shore. There are more fish here, larger ones, along with what might be water plants growing in the mud. The Romans loved water features that felt alive, that had movement and inhabitants rather than just being static decorative elements. This pond probably took years to establish properly, to get the right balance of plants and fish and water chemistry so that it would stay clear and healthy, without constant intervention. You walk around the pond's perimeter, enjoying the way the path curves to follow the irregular shoreline. At various points there are benches positioned to take advantage of particular views across the water. One looks toward the island pavilion, another faces away from it, toward a section of the garden where cypress trees have been planted in a precise row, their dark vertical shapes creating a dramatic contrast against the evening sky. Near one of these benches you find what appears to be a small dock or platform extending out over the water. It's made of wood, which is interesting because wood requires more maintenance than stone and will need to be replaced periodically. But wood also feels warmer and more organic, and standing on it creates a sensation of being suspended over the water rather than separated from it by stone and earth. There are metal rings attached to posts at the corners of the platform, probably for tying up small boats. Because of course there are boats, you can see two of them pulled up on a small beach at one end of the pond. They're not large, just simple rowboats carved from single pieces of wood and sealed with pitch, but they're beautifully made, with decorative carvings along the gunnels and painted designs that are hard to make out in the dim light. The emperor could take these out onto the pond, probably rowed by a slave while he reclined and contemplated whatever emperors contemplate while floating on artificial bodies of water in the middle of their private gardens. The area around the pond has a different character from the rest of the garden you've explored so far. It's less formally organised, with plants that seem to grow more naturally, even though you know intellectually that every single thing here has been deliberately placed. There are willows trailing their branches into the water, reeds growing in the shallows, wildflowers that probably aren't actually wild at all but have been carefully selected to look unstudied and spontaneous. The Romans were good at creating this kind of calculated naturalness. Landscapes that appeared effortless but actually required just as much work as the more obviously formal sections. You're walking along the water's edge when you notice something half hidden in the reeds. It's a small statue, maybe 2 feet tall, depicting some minor deity or nature spirit. The statue is deliberately placed to look like it's been there forever, partially overgrown with moss and water plants, as if it were an ancient artifact from some previous civilization rather than something commissioned probably within the last decade. This is another layer of the garden's appeal, this suggestion of history and mystery, as if you might discover something unexpected and meaningful if you just looked carefully enough. The path leads you away from the pond through an area planted with fruit trees. These are more practical than ornamental, though the Romans certainly appreciated the aesthetic value of trees heavy with apples or pears or figs. The trees here are mature, their branches spreading wide and creating a canopy that would provide welcome shade during the day. Right now in late summer, some of them are bearing fruit, and you can see workers' ladders propped against trunks, suggesting that harvest is ongoing. There's something almost melancholy about fruit trees in a garden like this. They're reminders that even imperial estates need to produce something useful, that beauty alone isn't quite sufficient justification for all this land and labour. The fruit from these trees probably ends up on the emperor's table, served at those elaborate banquets you keep imagining, but there's almost certainly more than the imperial household can consume. The surplus likely goes to the workers, or gets sold in the markets, or gets processed into preserves and dried fruit for winter consumption. Beyond the orchard you find another architectural element, this one more utilitarian than decorative. It's a storehouse, solidly built from stone and brick, with small high windows to keep the interior cool while still providing some ventilation. The door is closed but not locked, and when you push it open you find exactly what you'd expect. Storage for garden equipment, supplies, tools that are too valuable to leave outside. There are also amphorae, those distinctive Roman storage jars, probably containing oils or wines or other liquids used in garden maintenance or entertaining. The storehouse smells of clay and olive oil and something slightly fermented that you can't quite identify. Everything is organised with the same attention to detail you've noticed throughout the garden. Tools are sorted by type and size. Containers are labelled in Latin with their contents and the date they were filled. There's even what appears to be an inventory list scratched into a wax tablet hanging on one wall, recording exactly what's stored here and in what quantities. This level of organisation speaks to professional management, probably a freedman or trusted slave who's been given significant responsibility for keeping the garden functioning smoothly. Running a place like this isn't just about having a good aesthetic sense, it's logistics and planning and resource management, making sure there's always enough of whatever's needed before it's needed, anticipating problems before they become emergencies. The person in charge of this storehouse is essentially managing a small business, one that happens to produce beauty instead of goods for sale. You close the storehouse door and continue walking, following a path that's taking you gradually back toward the main residential section of the complex. The light is almost completely gone now, with only the oil lamps providing illumination, and the garden has taken on a dreamlike quality. Shadows are deep and ambiguous. Sounds seem both closer and more distant than they should be. The scent of night-blooming flowers, jasmine maybe, has become stronger as the temperature dropped, and it mixes with the ever-present smell of water and stone and earth. Ahead you can see more substantial buildings, the actual living quarters where the emperor and his household spend their time when they're not wandering through gardens. Even from here you can see that these buildings are designed to integrate with the garden rather than being separate from it. Every room probably has multiple windows or openings facing onto green space. Courtyards and atriums bring the garden inside, blurring the distinction between interior and exterior space in that particularly Roman way. The residential buildings are arranged around a central courtyard that's even more elaborately landscaped than the sections you've been walking through. This is the heart of the complex, the space that the emperor would see every time he stepped outside his private chambers, and the designers have clearly saved their best work for this location. The courtyard is rectangular, maybe 60 feet by 40, with a colonnade running around all four sides, creating a covered walkway that protects against both sun and rain. The columns are marble, naturally probably imported from Greece or Asia Minor, because Roman marble tends toward the yellowish, and these are a brilliant white that practically glows in the lamplight. Each column is carved with subtle decorative details, nothing too ostentatious, but enough to indicate that these aren't just structural elements. They're art pieces that happen to also hold up a roof. The capitals are Corinthian, that most elaborate of Roman styles, with their carved acanthus leaves and scrolling volutes. In the centre of the courtyard there's a fountain that makes all the others you've seen look modest. This one is three-tiered, with water cascading from a central spout at the top, down through increasingly wider basins before collecting in a large pool at ground level. The sound of it dominates the space, not so loud that you can't hear yourself think, but loud enough that it would mask conversations, provide acoustic privacy even in what's technically an open area. Around the fountain, the courtyard is paved with more of those intricate mosaics, these ones depicting marine themes, dolphins and fish and octopi and various sea creatures that the Romans believed in but that probably never existed. The planting beds in this courtyard contain only the most perfect specimens. Every plant here is pruned and shaped and positioned to look its absolute best. There are no experiments here, no plants that are still establishing themselves or that might fail. Everything is mature, healthy, and arranged with such precision that you suspect someone measures the spacing with actual instruments rather than just eyeballing it. The overall effect is one of complete control, nature transformed into something that's almost architectural in its regularity. Around the edges of the courtyard, tucked into alcoves between columns, there are more statues. These aren't minor deities or garden spirits like what you saw by the pond. These are major works, probably Greek originals or very expensive Roman copies, depicting gods and heroes and mythological scenes. You recognize Apollo, his marble eyes blank but somehow still conveying that divine indifference that gods are supposed to have. There's a Venus, different from the one you saw earlier, this one more modest and contemplative. A Hercules, muscled and powerful, holding his club. The statues are positioned so that they're visible from inside the surrounding rooms, creating sightlines that connect interior space with the courtyard. From the emperor's bedroom he probably has a view directly toward one particular statue, chosen for its symbolic meaning or just because he likes looking at it. The Romans thought carefully about these things, about what you saw when you woke up or when you were eating dinner or when you were conducting business. Every view was an opportunity to reinforce certain ideas or values, or just to provide aesthetic pleasure. You walk along the colonnade, staying in the shadows where the lamplight doesn't quite reach. Through the windows opening onto the courtyard, you can see into some of the rooms. Most are dark, but a few show signs of occupation. In one there are slaves moving around, probably preparing the space for tomorrow, or cleaning up from today. In another you see what might be the emperor himself, though it's hard to tell from this distance and angle. A figure in white, standing near a window, looking out at the garden, perfectly still, as if contemplating something important, or possibly just enjoying the view. The figure moves away from the window after a moment, and you're left wondering what it must feel like to live in a place like this. To have this much beauty and luxury and carefully curated perfection surrounding you at all times. Does it become normal after a while? Do you stop noticing the fountains and the mosaics and the imported flowers? Or does the awareness of what you have and what it costs to maintain create its own kind of pressure, a constant reminder of the power you hold and the responsibilities that come with it? You continue around the colonnade until you reach a doorway that leads into another section of the garden, this one apparently more private than what you've seen so far. The doorway is guarded by a statue of Priapus, the god of gardens and boundaries, his exaggerated features making clear that this is a space with different rules from public areas. Beyond the doorway you can see another courtyard, smaller and more intimate, with plantings that are denser and more sensual. This is probably where the emperor comes when he wants complete privacy, or when he's entertaining in ways that aren't meant for general observation. This private garden is designed on a more human scale than the grand spaces you've been exploring. The paths are narrower, the plantings closer, creating an atmosphere that's almost enclosed despite being technically outdoors. The walls surrounding this space are higher too, probably 12 feet tall, ensuring that no one from outside can see in, and that the people using this garden are completely protected from observation. Even the stars seem more distant here, visible only as a narrow strip of sky overhead. The planting choices in this section are noticeably different. There are more flowering vines, things like honeysuckle and climbing roses that create curtains of vegetation screening different areas from each other. The flowers here are heavily scented, almost aggressively so, creating an atmosphere that's more intoxicating than refreshing. There are also plants that you recognize as having medicinal or mind-altering properties. Opium poppies growing in decorative clusters, what might be hemp, though it's hard to tell in the lamplight. Various herbs that could be used for cooking but that you suspect serve other purposes in a space like this. The fountain here is smaller and quieter, just a gentle trickle into a marble basin that's carved with more of those erotic scenes you saw on the Priapus statue. The water is scattered with flower petals, rose and jasmine and others you can't identify, creating a perfumed pool that would be pleasant to dip your hands into or possibly to bathe in, though the basin seems too small for that. There are towels draped over a nearby bench, soft fabric that's probably been scented with oils. The furniture in this garden is more luxurious than what you've seen elsewhere. The couches are lower and wider, clearly designed for reclining rather than sitting, and they're upholstered not just with fabric but with actual padding that makes them almost bed-like. There are small tables positioned within easy reach, their surfaces inlaid with coloured stones in geometric patterns. Oil lamps hang from hooks at various heights, creating pools of warm light that don't quite overlap, so there are areas that remain in shadow for anyone seeking privacy even within this already private space. You notice details that suggest regular use. A wine cup left on one of the tables, still containing dregs that haven't dried yet. Cushions that are slightly displaced, as if someone was lying on them recently and nobody has come to straighten them. The smell of perfume or incense lingering in the air, something with cinnamon and myrrh and other expensive spices. This isn't a showpiece garden that gets used occasionally for special events. People spend time here regularly, using it for exactly the purposes its design suggests. Along one wall, there's a small structure that you initially take for another pavilion but that turns out to be more substantial. It's actually a bathhouse, scaled down for private use rather than the massive public baths that Romans are famous for. The building has 3 rooms, a changing area, a warm room with heated floors, and a cold plunge pool. The heating system is clever, using the same water that feeds the garden fountains to warm the floors through a series of pipes, so nothing is wasted. Even in creating spaces for pleasure and relaxation, Roman engineers couldn't resist finding efficient solutions. The plunge pool is filled with cold water that's probably from the same underground sources as the fountains. Flower petals float on the surface here too, and there are small oil lamps set into niches around the edges, creating a soft glow that reflects off the water. The pool is deep enough to fully submerge yourself, maybe 5 feet at the center, with steps leading down on one side. You can imagine how refreshing this would be after time in the heated room, that shock of cold water on overheated skin. Back outside, you find another feature that's characteristic of private Roman gardens, a relatively open area set up for exercise or games. There's a sand pit for wrestling or jumping, a wall with marks indicating where balls should be thrown, equipment for various activities that Romans considered essential for maintaining physical fitness. Even in their private leisure spaces, Romans felt obligated to include areas for physical improvement. The idea of pure relaxation without some kind of self-betterment component seemed to make them slightly uncomfortable. Beyond the exercise area, the garden becomes less structured, transitioning into what's almost a wild grove. The trees here are allowed to grow more freely, their branches creating a canopy that blocks out most of the remaining light. This is probably where the garden ends, the boundary between cultivated space and whatever lies beyond. You can hear different sounds here, night birds and insects and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It's not scary exactly, but it does create a sense of boundary, a reminder that even imperial gardens have limits. You turn back toward the main areas of the garden, leaving the private spaces behind, and feeling oddly relieved to return to sections that feel less intimate, less charged with the residue of personal activities. The transition is gradual, marked by the plantings becoming more formal again, and the paths widening to accommodate multiple people walking side by side. You're heading toward a section you haven't explored yet, one that sounds different from everywhere else you've been. The sound is what draws you there. It's not water this time, though water is always present in the background of Roman gardens. This is music, or at least the suggestion of it. Wind chimes made from hollow tubes of bronze or copper, suspended from the branches of trees in carefully calculated arrangements so that the breeze creates something approaching melody. The Romans loved these kinds of automatic music makers, devices that turn natural forces into art without requiring human intervention. It fit their philosophy that nature could be harnessed and controlled but should still retain some element of unpredictability. The wind chime garden is planted with trees that allow breeze to flow through easily. No dense hedges here, nothing that would block air movement. The trees are mostly varieties with small leaves that rustle pleasantly in the wind, creating a layered soundscape of chimes and leaves and the occasional bird that hasn't yet settled for the night. The paths through this section are paved with gravel instead of stone, so your footsteps create another layer of sound, a crunching rhythm that announces your presence without being unpleasantly loud. Scattered throughout this area are benches and small pavilions, places where you could sit and simply listen. The Romans understood something about passive entertainment, about the value of experiences that didn't require active participation. You could come here and do nothing except exist in this carefully constructed acoustic environment, and that would be considered a perfectly valid use of your time, especially if you were an emperor with the weight of an empire on your shoulders. Sometimes what you needed most was permission to just sit and listen to bronze tubes ringing in the breeze. You settle onto one of the benches and let the sounds wash over you. It's not exactly relaxing, not in the way that silence would be, but it's engaging enough to occupy your mind without requiring any effort. Your thoughts can wander while the chimes provide a kind of sonic anchor, something to return to when your mind drifts too far. You understand why this section exists, why someone thought it was worth the expense and engineering to create a garden devoted entirely to sound. After some time that's impossible to measure, you stand and continue walking. The path takes you past a small amphitheatre, an intimate outdoor space with tiered stone seating facing a small stage area. This is where actual musicians would perform, or actors would stage private productions for the emperor and select guests. The acoustics are probably excellent, designed with the same attention to detail that went into everything else here. The stage area is decorated with more frescoes, these ones depicting theatrical masks and scenes from famous plays. The amphitheatre is empty now, but you can imagine it filled with people dressed in their finest clothes, watching performances while servants circulated with wine and delicacies. The Romans loved theatre, loved stories told through performance, and having a private venue meant the emperor could see whatever productions he wanted without dealing with the crowds and chaos of public theatres. It was another layer of control, another way of curating experience to match personal preference. Beyond the amphitheatre you find what appears to be a library or study space, though it's built as an open pavilion rather than an enclosed room. The structure has walls on 3 sides, open to the garden on the 4th, with shelves carved into the stone walls to hold scrolls. There are reading tables and comfortable chairs, oil lamps positioned to provide good light without creating too much heat. This is where an emperor could come to read philosophy or history or poetry, surrounded by garden views and the constant sound of water from a nearby fountain. The scrolls visible on the shelves cover a range of subjects. You recognize some titles even from this distance, works by Greek philosophers and Roman historians that have survived into the modern era. Others are probably texts that have been lost, copies that existed in this library and nowhere else, and that disappeared when the garden fell into disrepair and the library's contents were scattered or destroyed. It's a melancholy thought, that casual destruction of knowledge, books left to decay because nobody thought they were worth saving. Near the library pavilion there's a sundial mounted on a stone pedestal. The dial is beautifully made, with marks indicating not just the hours but also the positions of various celestial bodies throughout the year. The Romans were good at timekeeping, understood the movement of sun and stars with impressive accuracy. This sundial serves both practical and symbolic purposes, marking the passage of time while also demonstrating the owner's sophistication and learning. The garden paths lead you next to what can only be described as a zoo, though that word doesn't quite capture what you're seeing. It's a collection of exotic animals kept in enclosures that are far more elaborate than simple cages. Each animal has its own space designed to approximate its natural habitat, at least to the extent that Roman knowledge and resources allowed. This is another display of wealth and power, the ability to collect and maintain creatures from the far edges of the empire and beyond. The first enclosure contains peacocks, which are relatively common in wealthy Roman households but still impressive with their iridescent plumage. These particular birds are clearly well cared for, their feathers pristine and their movements confident. They're not afraid of humans, probably hand-raised and accustomed to being around people. One of them spreads its tail feathers, that magnificent fan of eyes and colors, responding to something you can't see or hear. The display is automatic, instinctive, but it looks deliberate, as if the bird is performing for your benefit. Further along, you find more unusual animals. There are monkeys in a large enclosure with artificial trees and climbing structures. They are active even at this late hour, swinging between perches and making soft chattering sounds to each other. The Romans were fascinated by monkeys, seeing them as curious parodies of humanity, and wealthy households often kept them as exotic pets. These ones appear healthy and reasonably content, at least to your untrained eye, though you wonder what their lives would have been like in whatever forests they were taken from. The most impressive enclosure contains a lion, or what the Romans called a lion. It's massive, probably an adult male, pacing the perimeter of its space with that restless energy that big cats in captivity always seem to have. The enclosure is large, maybe 50 feet across, with high stone walls and a sheltered area where the animal can retreat from weather or observation. There's a pool for drinking and cooling off, and what appears to be fresh meat scattered on the ground, suggesting the lion has been recently fed. Keeping a lion alive in Rome requires enormous resources. The animal needs substantial amounts of meat every day, probably provided by the same systems that supply the emperor's kitchens. It needs clean water, shade, space to move. It needs handlers brave or foolish enough to enter its enclosure for cleaning and maintenance. And for what? So the emperor can occasionally walk past and look at it, can demonstrate to visitors that he possesses one of nature's most powerful predators. The entire arrangement seems almost absurd until you remember that absurdity itself is a kind of power, the ability to do things for no practical reason except that you can. Beyond the lion, there are birds in elaborate aviaries, structures made of bronze wire mesh that allow the birds to fly while keeping them confined. You see parrots and other tropical species, their feathers showing colors that seem impossible in the lamplight. There are also more common birds that have probably been included for their songs rather than their appearance. The Romans loved songbirds, kept them in their homes and gardens, bred them for specific qualities of voice and temperament. One aviary is devoted entirely to doves, white ones that symbolize peace and domesticity in Roman culture. There are dozens of them, moving in slow patterns around their space, cooing to each other in that distinctive way that doves have. The sound is soothing, hypnotic even, and you understand why someone might include them in a garden designed for relaxation. They provide another layer to the acoustic environment, something gentle and non-threatening. There's an enclosure you can't quite figure out at first. It contains what looks like a pond surrounded by marshy vegetation, but you don't immediately see any animals. Then you notice movement in the water, something large and dark just beneath the surface, a crocodile possibly, or some other reptile imported from Egypt or Africa. The creature surfaces briefly, just its eyes and snout visible, then submerges again. The Romans were both fascinated and terrified by crocodiles, saw them as dragons or monsters, and having one in your private garden was the ultimate exotic acquisition. The animal collection extends beyond what you can see in individual enclosures. There are chickens and other domestic fowl wandering freely through certain sections of the garden, probably providing fresh eggs and serving as pest control. There are fish in many of the ponds and fountains, as you've already noticed. There are probably cats somewhere, kept to control rodents and snakes. A garden this elaborate is actually an entire ecosystem, with dozens of species existing in carefully maintained relationships. You leave the animal enclosures and find yourself in a section of the garden that seems dedicated to sensory experiences beyond just sight and sound. This area is planted almost exclusively with herbs and aromatic plants, creating what amounts to a perfume garden, where every step brings a new combination of scents. The Romans were obsessed with smell, both avoiding bad odors and pursuing pleasant ones with an intensity that seems almost excessive, until you remember what most of ancient Rome actually smelled like. The herbs are organized in raised beds made of stone, each bed containing a single variety or carefully chosen combinations that complement each other. There's lavender, obviously, growing in enormous bushy clumps that are clearly cut regularly for oil production and dried sachets. The smell is strong even now, that distinctive sharp sweet scent that's supposed to be calming, but that can be overwhelming in large quantities. Next to the lavender, there's rosemary, another staple of Roman gardens, used for cooking and medicine and religious ceremonies. You recognize mint in several varieties, the leaves different shapes and sizes, but all producing variations on that cooling menthol sensation when crushed. There's thyme, low-growing and dense, probably planted near the edges of paths so that walking brushes against it and releases fragrance.
There's basil, which the Romans thought had both culinary and magical properties. There's rue, bitter and pungent, used for everything from flavoring food to warding off evil spirits to inducing abortions. That last use never explicitly stated but widely understood. Further into the aromatic garden you find plants that are more purely decorative, valued for their scent rather than practical applications. There are roses again, different varieties from what you saw earlier, these ones bred specifically for fragrance intensity. There are violets, small and humble looking but producing a scent so sweet it almost hurts. There are hyacinths and narcissus, both of which the Romans imported from Greece, along with the myths about young men transformed into flowers. Some of the plants here are familiar, others completely foreign. You see something with silver-grey leaves that might be sage, or might be some other Mediterranean herb. There are plants with waxy leaves that release resinous scents when touched. There are vines producing small white flowers that smell like honey mixed with something spicier, cloves maybe or cinnamon. The overall effect is disorienting, your nose trying to process too many strong scents at once and eventually giving up and just registering everything as generically fragrant. In the center of the aromatic garden, there's a small building that turns out to be a perfume workshop. The Romans didn't just grow aromatic plants, they processed them into oils and unguents and perfumes that could be stored and transported and used long after the flowers had died. Inside the workshop, you find all the equipment needed for extraction and preparation. Clay vessels for steeping flowers in oil, straining cloths, storage jars, scales for measuring ingredients, and grinding stones for processing dried materials. The workshop smells incredible and slightly nauseating at the same time. It's the concentrated essence of hundreds of plants all mixed together with the oil and wax bases used to suspend fragrances. There are labeled jars on shelves indicating what each contains, though the labels are in Latin and use terminology that probably wouldn't mean much even if you could read them clearly in the lamplight. Rose extract, iris root, something called Asiatic nard, which was apparently a wildly expensive aromatic plant imported from the Himalayas. This workshop represents another significant investment of resources and expertise. Someone here needs to know not just which plants produce good fragrances, but also how to extract those fragrances without destroying them, how to blend different scents to create new ones, how to preserve the results so they don't go rancid. It's chemistry before chemistry existed as a discipline, practical knowledge built up through generations of trial and error and carefully guarded as trade secrets. You imagine the finished products from this workshop being used throughout the garden and the imperial household. Perfumed oils rubbed into skin after bathing, incense burned during dinners and religious ceremonies, scented unguents used in hair and beards, aromatic sachets placed in storage chests to keep clothes fresh. The Romans used perfume for everything, saw it as essential to civilized life, and an emperor would naturally want his own private production facility rather than buying from merchants. Leaving the perfume workshop, you follow a path that takes you past more planted beds, these ones containing vegetables and cooking herbs. Even in an imperial pleasure garden, there's space allocated for practical production. You see what might be lettuces, onions, and various greens that would end up in the kitchen. There are grapevines trained on trellises, producing fruit that would become wine or be eaten fresh. There are fig trees and olive trees, both essential to Roman cuisine and culture. The vegetable garden is less elaborately designed than other sections, but it's still more attractive than it needs to be. The beds are edged with decorative stones, the paths are swept clean, the plants are trained and pruned with the same attention to aesthetics that goes into the ornamental sections. Because even here, even in spaces devoted to food production, the garden is making a statement about control and abundance and the ability to transform raw nature into something ordered and beautiful. Past the vegetable gardens, you discover a section that seems dedicated to experimentation. This is where the gardeners try out new plants before committing them to prominent locations elsewhere in the garden. The beds here contain specimens that look younger and less established than what you've seen in other areas. Some are thriving, others are clearly struggling, a few have already died and are waiting to be removed and replaced. This is the backstage area of the garden, where the illusion of effortless perfection is revealed as the result of constant testing and adjustment. There are plants here you haven't seen anywhere else in the garden, species that are probably being evaluated for their suitability to Roman climate and soil. Some have labels attached on small stakes, noting where they came from and when they were planted. Others are unlabeled, their origin and purpose apparently obvious to whoever works in this section but mysterious to you. You see something with massive paddle-shaped leaves that's clearly from somewhere much more tropical than Italy. You see a plant with silvery foliage that might be from a desert region. You see vines and shrubs and small trees, all in various stages of establishment. The experimental garden is attended by a different category of worker than the maintenance staff you've seen elsewhere. These are specialists, people who understand plant physiology and propagation, who know how to read the subtle signs of health or disease. In modern terms, they're botanists and horticulturists, though those job titles don't exist yet. In Roman terms, they're probably educated slaves or freedmen who've spent years learning their craft, valuable enough that they have some measure of autonomy and respect despite their legal status. There's a greenhouse here too, smaller than the one you saw earlier, specifically for starting seeds and rooting cuttings. The interior is humid and crowded with containers holding plants at various stages of development. Everything is labeled and organized, suggesting systematic record-keeping about what works and what doesn't. This is science, basically, even if the theoretical framework that would later be called science doesn't exist yet. It's empirical observation and careful documentation, and the gradual accumulation of reliable knowledge about how plants grow. You find yourself thinking about the slaves and workers who maintain this entire complex. They're mostly invisible in the way that labor often is, present but not acknowledged, essential but not celebrated. The garden appears to run itself, to simply exist in a state of perpetual perfection. But that appearance requires dozens or hundreds of people working constantly. They're up before dawn to complete heavy work before the heat becomes unbearable. They're out after dark, lighting lamps and checking on plants. They work through winter maintaining systems and preparing for spring. They never stop. And what must it be like to be one of those workers, to spend your life creating and maintaining beauty that you're not allowed to fully enjoy? You can walk these paths, but only when you're working. You can see the emperor reclining in his pavilion, but you're the one serving him wine. You know every plant in the garden intimately because you're responsible for keeping them alive, but you don't get to simply sit and appreciate them. It's a complicated relationship, being that close to luxury while being fundamentally excluded from it. The garden also employs specialists beyond just gardeners. There are engineers who maintain the water systems, constantly monitoring flow rates and clearing blockages and repairing leaks. There are stonemasons who fix cracked paving and damaged statuary. There are painters who touch up frescoes as they fade. There are animal handlers who feed and clean up after the exotic menagerie. There are musicians and actors who perform in the amphitheater. There are cooks who prepare elaborate meals using ingredients from the garden. The operation employs a small town's worth of people, all working to support the leisure and pleasure of one man and his chosen guests. You walk past what appears to be workers' quarters, simple buildings that are functional rather than beautiful. The contrast with the opulent main buildings is stark. These structures have small windows, plain walls, minimal decoration. They're clean and maintained, but they're clearly meant to house people who are valued for their labor rather than their personhood. Inside you'd find cramped sleeping areas, communal eating spaces, storage for personal possessions that probably don't amount to much. There's a strange poignancy to the workers' quarters existing in the middle of all this elaborate beauty. The people who sleep here spend their days creating and maintaining paradise for someone else. They're surrounded by luxury but can't claim any of it as their own. When they're not working, they're here in these plain buildings, resting up so they can work again tomorrow. Their lives are comfortable by ancient standards probably, with reliable food and shelter and possibly even some small wages. But comfortable isn't the same as free, and proximity to wealth isn't the same as having wealth. The experimental garden blends gradually back into more finished areas, the plants becoming more established and the design more intentional as you walk. This transition mirrors something about how gardens actually work in time. They're never truly finished, always in the process of growing and changing and responding to seasons and weather and the interventions of gardeners. The line between experimental and established is fuzzy, because every part of a garden is always somewhat experimental, always adjusting to conditions that can't be completely controlled. You find yourself approaching a section of the garden that feels older than the rest, even though the entire complex was supposedly built around the same time. The paths here are more worn, the stones smoothed by what seems like centuries of footsteps even though it's only been decades. The plants are more mature, their root systems well established, their branches spreading with a confidence that comes from years of undisturbed growth. This might be the original core of the garden, the first section built before the project expanded into the sprawling complex it eventually became. The centerpiece of this older section is a massive oak tree, far too large to have been planted when the garden was created. This tree was already here, probably 100 years old or more when construction began, and someone made the decision to build around it rather than cutting it down. That decision says something about Roman attitudes toward nature, or at least about this particular emperor's attitudes. They were willing to conquer and reshape and control, yes, but they also recognized that some things had their own value, their own right to exist even if they complicated human plans. The oak spreads its branches over an area at least 50 feet in diameter, creating a canopy so dense that almost nothing grows directly beneath it. The space under the tree has been paved with stone and furnished with benches arranged in a circle, creating a kind of outdoor room defined by the tree's shade. During the day, this would be one of the coolest spots in the entire garden, protected from sun by all those leaves. At night, like now, it feels separate from the rest of the garden, darker and more enclosed, almost like being inside despite having open sky overhead. The trunk of the oak is enormous, probably 6 or 7 feet in diameter, its bark deeply furrowed with age. There are offerings left at its base, small things that suggest people treat this tree with some reverence. A few coins, a garland of flowers that's starting to wilt, what might be a prayer written on a scrap of papyrus. The Romans were animistic in ways that their official religion didn't quite acknowledge, believing that old trees and springs and special places had their own spirits that deserved respect and propitiation. You sit on one of the benches under the oak and look up through its branches. The leaves are rustling in the night breeze, creating patterns of movement against the stars. Sitting here, you feel the weight of the tree's age, the fact that it was alive before Rome reached its current extent, before this particular emperor was born, before the garden existed. It will probably still be alive after all of this is gone, after the fountains have stopped flowing and the exotic plants have died and the buildings have crumbled. Trees have a way of making human projects feel temporary. There's a plaque attached to the tree's trunk, bronze with Latin text that's been worn smooth in places by people touching it. You can't read it in the dim light, but you imagine it says something about the tree's significance, maybe claims it's sacred to some deity or commemorates some event that happened here. Romans loved plaques and inscriptions, loved leaving written records of things they thought were important. Most of those records are lost now, the bronze melted down or corroded beyond reading, the stories forgotten. Around the oak, the garden takes on a different character. The plants here are chosen for shade tolerance, things that can thrive with limited sun filtering through the oak's canopy. There are ferns and hostas and other low-growing plants that create a lush ground cover. There are also more statues, but these are smaller and more worn than the pristine marble figures you've seen elsewhere. These might be older pieces, acquired before the emperor came to power, or they might be deliberately placed here to suggest age and continuity. One statue in particular catches your attention. It depicts an old man, bearded and thoughtful, holding a scroll and looking downward as if reading or contemplating. The style is Greek, several centuries old at least, the marble weathered in a way that makes the figure look even more ancient than it is. This is probably meant to be a philosopher, maybe one of the Stoics whose teachings were popular among educated Romans. Having this statue here, under the old oak, creates a sense of wisdom and continuity, suggesting that the garden is a place for serious thought as well as pleasure. The paths leading away from the oak are less formal than in other sections, almost wandering rather than following clear geometric patterns. This informal quality might be original to the garden's design, or it might have developed over time as gardeners adjusted paths to accommodate root growth and natural changes in the landscape. Either way, it creates a more relaxed atmosphere, a sense that you're exploring rather than following a prescribed route. You follow one of these wandering paths and find it leads to a small shrine, just a simple stone structure with a roof and an altar. The shrine is dedicated to the garden itself, or rather to the spirits believed to protect gardens and ensure their fertility. There are offerings here too, more substantial than what you saw at the oak's base: fresh flowers, small cakes, a cup of wine that hasn't evaporated yet. The shrine sits in a grove of cypress trees, their dark vertical shapes creating a somber atmosphere that contrasts with the generally cheerful character of the rest of the garden. Cypresses are associated with death and mourning in Roman culture, often planted in cemeteries, but they're also valued for their beauty and the pleasant resin smell their wood produces. Having them here introduces a note of memento mori into the garden, a reminder that even emperors die, even perfect moments end. The altar inside the shrine is made of marble, simple and unadorned except for stains from burnt offerings. There are ashes in a bronze bowl, remnants from incense or small sacrifices made to keep the garden spirits happy. The Romans were practical about religion, treating it as a kind of transaction where you gave offerings and expected results in return. If the garden prospered, the spirits were satisfied. If plants died or fountains broke, maybe you needed to offer more. Behind the shrine, almost hidden by the cypresses, there's a small family tomb. This is unexpected in a pleasure garden, but it makes a kind of sense once you think about it. Roman aristocrats often kept tombs on their private property, wanting their ancestors close even in death. This particular tomb is modest, just a stone structure with space for a few sarcophagi and some memorial inscriptions. You can't read the names in the darkness, but you imagine they're relatives of the emperor, family members who died before or during the garden's construction. The presence of the tomb adds another layer to the garden's meaning. It's not just a place for pleasure and relaxation, it's also a place for remembering, for connecting with the past, for acknowledging mortality even while surrounded by beauty and luxury. The Romans had a less squeamish relationship with death than modern people tend to, kept skulls and funeral masks in their homes, held feasts at gravesides. Having a tomb in the garden would seem natural rather than morbid. You leave the cypress grove and its memento mori atmosphere, returning to paths that feel more alive and present-focused. The garden opens up again into another series of planted beds and water features, these ones designed around a theme of abundance and fertility. There are fruit trees heavy with late summer produce, grapevines hanging with clusters ready for harvest, plants chosen for their generous yields. Even the statuary here depicts gods and goddesses associated with plenty. Pomona with her fruit basket, Ceres with her grain sheaf, Bacchus with his wine cup and attendant saches. This section would be at its best in autumn, during harvest season, when everything is producing at maximum capacity. Right now in late summer it's still impressive but not quite at peak. You can see workers with baskets collecting fruit from the trees, probably gathering it before nocturnal animals can raid the branches. They work quietly and efficiently, barely glancing at you as you pass. They're used to ignoring anyone who walks through the garden, trained to be invisible unless directly addressed. The abundance theme extends to the water features here, which are more exuberant than what you've seen elsewhere. One fountain shoots water 15 feet into the air, the spray catching lamplight and creating momentary rainbows. Another features a series of spillways where water cascades down multiple levels, each level slightly offset so the overall effect is of water bouncing and tumbling with almost violent energy. These aren't the calm contemplative fountains from earlier sections. These are celebrations of excess, demonstrations of what you can do when you have unlimited water and the engineering knowledge to move it however you want. Near the most elaborate fountain, there's a dining area set up for outdoor banquets. The triclinium arrangement is familiar from Roman dining rooms, 3 couches arranged in a U-shape around a central table. But this is scaled up to accommodate many more guests. There are probably spaces for 20 or 30 people to recline comfortably, all positioned so they can see the fountains and enjoy the garden views while eating. The couches are built into stone platforms, permanent fixtures rather than movable furniture, with cushions that can be brought out and taken in as needed. You imagine what dinner here would be like, course after course of elaborate food, probably including produce from the garden itself to emphasize the connection between luxury and the land. Wine flowing freely, sweetened and spiced the way Romans preferred it, musicians playing somewhere out of sight, providing entertainment without being obtrusive. Conversation getting louder and less guarded as the evening progressed and the wine took effect. All of it happening in this perfectly orchestrated setting where every detail served to impress guests and reinforce the emperor's power and taste. The dining area includes a small kitchen building, close enough that food can be brought out hot but far enough that cooking smells and heat don't overwhelm the diners. Through the kitchen windows you can see braziers and preparation tables and hanging pots and all the equipment needed to produce elaborate meals. There are probably slaves in there right now, either cleaning up from today or preparing for tomorrow, their work never quite finished because the demands of an imperial household are constant.
You leave the lake behind and follow a path that curves along its shoreline before eventually leading away toward a section of the garden you haven't explored yet. This path is bordered by weeping willows that trail their branches almost to the ground, creating natural curtains that partially obscure the view ahead. Walking through this area feels like passing through a series of green rooms, each one separated from the next by these hanging branches that you have to push aside gently to continue forward. The willows give way to a more open area, and you find yourself in what can only be described as a sculpture garden. Unlike the statuary you've seen scattered throughout other sections, here the sculptures are the main attraction, arranged in a carefully curated outdoor gallery.
The pieces range from small, intimate works that you could almost miss if you weren't paying attention to massive installations that dominate entire clearings. Some are clearly ancient, weathered Greek and Egyptian pieces that were already centuries old when they arrived here. Others are newer, Roman copies or original commissions, their surfaces still crisp and detailed. The sculptures are arranged thematically rather than chronologically. One area contains only depictions of athletes and warriors, bronze and marble figures frozen in moments of physical exertion or combat. Another section focuses on mythological scenes, showing gods and heroes in various dramatic situations. There's a group of portrait busts, probably famous Romans or Greek philosophers, their faces serious and thoughtful. Each grouping creates its own atmosphere, its own conversation between the pieces and the viewer. What strikes you is how these sculptures interact with the garden setting. They're not displayed against neutral backgrounds like they would be in a modern museum. Instead, they're positioned so that plants and water features and architectural elements become part of the composition. A statue of Venus rising from the waves is placed next to a fountain so that real water surrounds her marble form. A bronze athlete seems to be running through actual foliage. A philosopher sits on a bench that's real stone rather than sculpted marble, inviting you to sit beside him. The lighting in this section is particularly well considered. Each sculpture has its own lamps positioned to highlight certain features and create dramatic shadows. The overall effect is theatrical, transforming static objects into dynamic presences that seem almost alive in the flickering light. You can imagine visiting this garden during the day when everything would look completely different, the sculptures revealed by bright sun rather than lamp glow. But there's something special about seeing them this way, mysterious and slightly magical. Between the major sculptural groupings, there are smaller works placed almost casually, as if they just happen to be there. A small bronze bird perched on a branch, a marble hand emerging from plantings as if the rest of the statue is buried beneath. A child's face peering around a tree trunk. These hidden pieces reward careful observation, creating a sense that the garden is full of secrets waiting to be discovered. You pause in front of a particularly striking piece, a life-sized marble figure of a young man with an expression of such intense longing that it's almost uncomfortable to look at. The sculptor has captured something raw and vulnerable, some emotion that feels too private to be on public display even though this garden is anything but public. There's a label at the base identifying the subject as Antinous, the young lover of Emperor Hadrian who drowned in the Nile and was subsequently deified by his grief-stricken partner. The presence of this statue suggests something about the emperor who owns this garden, some connection to that earlier ruler's famous devotion or perhaps just an appreciation for beautiful tragic things. You wonder what it means to display this kind of intimate emotional artifact in a pleasure garden, whether it's meant to evoke genuine feeling, or whether it's just another beautiful object to be collected and appreciated like the exotic plants and rare animals. The sculpture garden eventually transitions into an area that feels more like a museum than a garden, with covered walkways protecting more delicate pieces from weather. These walkways are open-sided, allowing air circulation while providing shelter from rain and direct sun. The pieces displayed here include painted terracotta, bronze reliefs, and carved ivory, materials that wouldn't survive outdoor exposure. There are also smaller objects, jewelry, coins, carved gems, ancient weapons, all arranged in cases or on pedestals. This is essentially a private collection, objects acquired through purchase or conquest or inheritance, assembled according to someone's particular interests and tastes. Looking at the range and quality of what's displayed, you realize you're seeing wealth on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. Each piece represents not just its material value but also the resources required to acquire it, transport it, display it properly. Some of these objects came from the far edges of the empire. Some were already ancient when Rome was young. Each has its own history, its own journey to this garden. The covered walkways lead to a building that's larger and more substantial than the various pavilions and shelters you've encountered throughout the garden. This is actually a proper villa, a residential structure that's part of the garden complex but distinct from the main imperial palace you glimpsed earlier. The villa is designed for extended stays, somewhere the emperor could retreat when he wanted more privacy than even the private sections of the main palace provided. The villa's architecture is elegant and understated compared to the grand public buildings of Rome. It's built around a central courtyard, following the traditional Roman plan but executed with exceptional materials and craftsmanship. The walls are faced with marble, different colors and patterns in various rooms, creating visual variety. The floors are mosaic throughout, not just decorative borders but full scenes depicting landscapes and still lifes and geometric patterns so complex they're almost dizzying to look at. You enter through a vestibule that opens onto the central courtyard, and the space takes your breath away despite the late hour and limited light. The courtyard is essentially an indoor garden, open to the sky but surrounded by the villa's rooms on all four sides. There's a long reflecting pool running down the center, its still water perfectly mirroring the columns and plantings surrounding it. The plantings here are chosen for their ability to thrive in the partially shaded conditions, ferns and ivies and small trees that don't require full sun. The rooms opening onto the courtyard are furnished simply but expensively. You can see into several through their open doorways, a library with scroll cases lining the walls, a bedroom with a massive bed draped in silk, a dining room with couches and tables positioned to take advantage of courtyard views. Each room is decorated with frescoes, the walls covered in painted scenes that extend the garden theme indoors. One room shows a garden view so realistic you almost think you're looking through a window rather than at a painted wall. The villa includes its own bathing complex, smaller than the public baths Romans were famous for but still elaborate by any reasonable standard. There are the standard 3 rooms: frigidarium for cold bathing, tepidarium for warm bathing, coldarium for hot bathing. Each room is decorated differently, with the cold room done in blues and greens suggesting water and coolness, the warm room in earth tones, the hot room in reds and oranges that emphasize heat. The mosaics on these floors depict sea creatures and water scenes, continuing the aquatic theme. The heating system for the baths uses the same hypercost technology found throughout wealthy Roman buildings, where fires heat air that circulates under raised floors and through wall cavities. The system is efficient but requires constant attention, slaves feeding fires and monitoring temperatures to keep each room at its proper level. Even now, late at night, you can feel warmth radiating from the floors in the coldarium, suggesting the fires are still burning or at least still hot enough to maintain temperature. Beyond the bathing complex, there's a private gymnasium, a room equipped for exercise and physical training. The equipment is simple: weights made of stone and lead, a climbing rope, a sand pit for wrestling or jumping. The Romans believed strongly in maintaining physical fitness, seeing it as essential to both health and moral character. Even in a place dedicated primarily to leisure and contemplation, there's space set aside for vigorous activity. The villa also contains a surprisingly large kitchen, considering this is meant to be a retreat from the main palace where presumably most meals would be prepared. The kitchen is well equipped with multiple ovens, a large hearth, storage for ingredients, and all the tools needed to produce elaborate meals. There are preserved foods in amphorae and hanging baskets, dried fruit, cured meats, pickled vegetables, everything needed to sustain a household without constantly sending to the main stores. You climb a staircase to the villa's upper floor, which is arranged as a series of sleeping chambers and private sitting rooms. Each chamber has windows overlooking different parts of the garden, allowing occupants to choose their view according to preference or time of day. The rooms are smaller and more intimate than the grand spaces downstairs, designed for individuals or couples rather than groups. The furnishings are luxurious but not overwhelming, creating spaces that feel comfortable rather than ostentatious. From one upper window you can see nearly the entire garden complex spread out below. The lamplight reveals paths and water features, buildings and planted areas, all arranged in that careful composition that looks natural but is actually meticulously planned. You can trace your route through the garden, remembering the different areas you've explored and recognizing how they fit together into a coherent whole. The scale of what you're seeing is impressive even after hours of walking through it. This garden represents years of planning and construction, thousands of workers, resources drawn from across the empire, all to create a private paradise for one man. You descend from the villa's upper floor and exit through a different doorway than the one you entered, finding yourself in yet another section of the garden that you haven't explored. This area has a quieter, more contemplative character than much of what you've seen. The paths are simpler, less elaborate in their paving. The plantings are more restrained, focusing on greenery and texture rather than colorful flowers. There are fewer fountains here, fewer architectural elements, fewer of the attention-grabbing features that define other sections. This appears to be a walking garden, designed specifically for movement and meditation rather than for sitting and observing. The paths form a series of loops and circuits, allowing you to walk for extended periods without retracing your steps or reaching dead ends. The Romans valued this kind of ambulatory meditation, the idea that walking could help clarify thought and calm the mind. Philosophers supposedly did their best thinking while walking, and wealthy Romans built gardens specifically to support this practice. The main path is wide enough for two people to walk side by side, suggesting this is also a place for conversation. You can imagine the emperor walking here with advisors or philosophers or foreign dignitaries, discussing matters of state or philosophy while their feet followed familiar circuits. The physical movement would provide a kind of rhythm to the conversation, a natural pacing that might make difficult topics easier to address. And if the conversation became too intense or uncomfortable, there was always the distraction of the garden itself, the changing views and seasonal plantings providing neutral subjects to comment on. Along the walking paths, there are markers indicating distances, small stones set into the paving at regular intervals, probably representing Roman measurements, though you're not sure of the exact conversion. Someone could use these markers to track their daily exercise, walking a certain number of circuits to maintain fitness. The Romans were surprisingly modern in their approach to health and exercise, understanding the connection between physical activity and well-being, even if their scientific explanations for why this mattered were often wrong. The plantings in this section emphasize evergreens and plants that maintain their structure year-round. There are shaped hedges, topiary in geometric forms, and trees pruned to create clean architectural lines. This is a garden designed to look good even in winter when many plants are dormant or dead. The green remains, the structure persists, ensuring that walks here are pleasant regardless of season. In a climate like Rome's, where winters are mild but still grey and damp, having a garden that doesn't completely lose its appeal during colder months would be important. You notice that the walking paths occasionally pass through pergolas covered in vines. These provide shade during summer and interesting overhead structure during winter when the vines are dormant. The pergolas also create natural breaks in the walking circuit, moments of transition between open and covered space that add variety to what might otherwise become monotonous. Walking the same path repeatedly could be meditative, but it could also be boring. These architectural elements provide just enough variation to keep the experience interesting. Near one of the pergolas you find a sundial mounted on a pedestal, similar to the one you saw earlier but simpler in its design. This one tracks only hours, not celestial positions or seasons. It's a practical device, allowing walkers to keep track of how long they've been exercising or meditating. Time moves differently in gardens, especially when you're walking in circles, and having a way to measure it objectively prevents the distortion that can happen when you're absorbed in thought or conversation. The walking garden includes several small shrines, simple structures dedicated to various gods associated with health, wisdom, and contemplation. One honors Aesculapius, god of medicine, with offerings of herbs and healing plants left by people hoping for continued health. Another honors Minerva, goddess of wisdom, with scrolls and writing tablets left as offerings or perhaps as records of insights gained during walks. The Romans integrated religion into every aspect of life, including exercise and meditation, seeing divine favor as essential to success in any endeavor. At one point, the walking path passes through a small grove of laurel trees, their glossy leaves catching lamplight and their branches creating a loose canopy overhead. Laurel was sacred to Apollo, god of music and poetry and prophecy, and Romans believed that inspiration could strike while walking through laurel groves. Whether anyone actually received divine inspiration here, or whether the belief itself was enough to encourage creative thinking, you can't know. But the grove creates a distinct atmosphere, slightly mysterious and charged with the possibility of revelation. The path eventually leads to a clearing that contains nothing but a simple stone bench facing a blank wall. The wall is painted white, completely undecorated, creating a space for pure contemplation without visual distraction. This is almost Zen-like in its minimalism, though of course Zen Buddhism won't exist for centuries, and the Romans would have had completely different philosophical frameworks for understanding why staring at a blank wall might be valuable. Still, the impulse is similar, creating space for thought by removing external stimuli. Beyond the walking garden, you discover an area that seems devoted entirely to water in its various forms and manifestations. This section explores water as both aesthetic element and sensory experience, presenting it in ways that highlight different qualities and characteristics. The area is arranged as a series of interconnected spaces, each one featuring water behaving differently, creating different sounds and visual effects and atmospheres. The first space contains a wall fountain, where water sheets down a perfectly smooth stone surface, creating a thin continuous film that catches light and creates subtle rippling patterns. The sound is a soft hissing, barely there, more suggestion than presence. This is water at its most gentle and restrained, demonstrating how even minimal flow can create beauty when properly designed. The wall itself is made of dark stone, probably slate or some similar material, chosen specifically because its color makes the water visible as it flows. The next space features the opposite approach, a fountain where water explodes upward with considerable force before falling back in a chaotic spray. The sound here is aggressive, almost violent, a constant roar that drowns out other noises. This is water as power, as barely controlled natural force, and standing near it you can feel mist on your skin and taste the mineral tang in the air. The Romans understood that water could be both tranquil and dramatic, and they enjoyed presenting both qualities, often in close proximity to emphasize the contrast. A third space contains what might be called a water organ, a complex arrangement of pipes and channels where water flowing through creates different musical tones. The system is automated, driven by water pressure rather than requiring human operation, and it produces an eerie whistling melody that shifts and changes as flow rates vary. This is water as music, as something that can be listened to rather than just looked at or felt. The technology involved is sophisticated, requiring precise calculations about pipe diameters and water pressure to achieve the desired tones. There's a space where water flows over different materials, demonstrating how surface texture affects behavior. Water flowing over smooth marble moves quickly and creates a high-pitched sound. Water flowing over rough stone moves more slowly and sounds deeper. Water flowing over gravel breaks into multiple small streams, each creating its own variation on the sound. This is almost an educational display, showing how water adapts to what it encounters, but it's presented as art rather than instruction. Another installation features water falling from a height into a deep pool, creating a sound like distant thunder. The pool is dark, deep enough that you can't see the bottom even with the lamplight, and the constant disturbance of the falling water creates patterns on the surface that are mesmerizing to watch. This is hypnotic water, the kind you could stare at for extended periods while your mind drifts and wanders. The Romans understood the meditative quality of moving water, its ability to occupy attention without demanding focused thought. There's a shallow basin where water flows in but can't flow out fast enough, so it gradually rises until it spills over all sides simultaneously, creating a perfectly level sheet of water that falls from all edges at once. This demonstrates control and precision, the ability to calculate exactly how much water to provide so that the basin stays constantly full but never floods. It's engineering as art, showing mastery over natural forces through mathematics and careful planning. One section features water at different temperatures. One basin contains cold water from underground sources. Another has been heated by the sun, or possibly by pipes carrying warm water from the villa's heating system. A third contains water that's been allowed to reach ambient temperature. You can put your hands in each and feel the dramatic differences, experiencing water as thermal sensation rather than just visual or auditory phenomenon. The Romans loved their baths and understood that temperature dramatically affects how water feels and how it makes you feel. There's an installation where water flows upward, seemingly defying gravity. The mechanism is hidden but probably involves siphon principles, using pressure differences to push water higher than its source. This is water as magic trick, as demonstration of technical knowledge that seems impossible to people who don't understand the physics involved. The Romans loved these kinds of displays, showing they could make nature do things that appeared supernatural. The final space in this water section contains a completely still pool, so smooth and undisturbed that it acts as a perfect mirror. After all the movement and sound and energy of the previous installations, this stillness is almost shocking. This is water as reflection, as surface, as boundary between above and below. The pool is probably fed from below at a rate so slow and gentle that it doesn't disturb the surface. Standing next to it, you can see yourself reflected perfectly, and above you the stars are doubled in the water. You step away from the final mirrored pool, leaving behind the last trembling reflection of your own face and the doubled stars, and you follow a narrow stone path that winds gently upward. The air grows warmer by slow degrees, as though you're walking into a pocket of sheltered heat that has been waiting here all day, gathering warmth like a cat curled in the sun. You sense that you're entering a different part of the Emperor's hidden world, less about spectacle, less about teaching lessons with water and engineering, and more about intimacy, scent, and quiet indulgence. Soon the path opens into what can only be described as the Emperor's perfumed garden, a place where the air itself seems curated, as though invisible hands are forever mixing and remixing aromas. The Romans took scent seriously, too seriously at times, if you listen to the moralizing writers, but here the idea feels innocent enough, almost childlike in its delight. You inhale deeply, and for a moment you're not even sure what you're smelling. Flowers, yes. Herbs, yes. But also something warm and resinous drifting between the leaves. You walk deeper, and the scents layer over one another so gently that you can barely separate them. The first cluster of plants you encounter are roses, of course they are, and not the fragile, overly romanticized roses you might expect, but sturdy, thick-petaled varieties bred for fragrance rather than beauty. Their smell is heavier than you anticipate, like honey mixed with heat. Bees wander lazily between blossoms, buzzing with the disinterested confidence of insects who know they are welcome here. You pass by slowly, the way one walks through steam in a bathhouse, letting the fragrance push softly against your skin. Just beyond the roses are the herbs, arranged in low terraces like steps made of scent. Mint spills over the edges first, its smell sharp and cool, almost medicinal. You brush your hand across it, and the fragrance leaps up immediately, as if the plant has been waiting for the slightest invitation to release its stored-up energy. Next comes basil, its sweetness rounder, fuller, a smell that belongs equally to kitchens and gardens. Then thyme, dry and woody, a scent that makes you imagine warm stone and afternoon sunlight even though it's long past dusk. A small domed structure sits in the center of this aromatic world. At first you think it might be a shrine, but as you move closer you realize it's more like a climate chamber, built to trap warmth and humidity. You step inside and find yourself surrounded by citrus trees, lemons, citrons, and small oranges glowing like lanterns among dark leaves. Their smell isn't overwhelming, it hangs lightly in the air, carried on the warm breath of the enclosed space. You stand there for a moment, letting the citrusy vapor settle around you, and you understand instantly why emperors built gardens like this. If power has a scent, perhaps this is it, clean, bright, quietly confident. When you leave the domed structure, your eyes adjust again to the dim starlit garden outside. A new aroma reaches you, something earthy, something grounding. You follow it, and find a patch of lavender, its pale flowers shimmering faintly in the night. The Romans used lavender for everything: baths, laundry, medicine, dreams. You crouch beside the plants, letting your fingers graze the tops, and the fragrance rises like a sigh. It's the kind of smell that reminds you of sleep without making you actually tired yet, as though it's nudging you toward drowsiness with infinite patience. Beyond the lavender lies a grove of laurel trees, their glossy leaves whispering softly whenever a breeze slips through. Laurels always carry a heavier symbolism: victory, triumph, poetry, ambition. But here they feel strangely gentle, just another part of this nighttime sanctuary. You pluck a leaf and rub it between your fingers. The smell is sharper than you expect, almost peppery, with an undercurrent of warmth. You can almost imagine a poet wandering here, feverishly trying to think of his next metaphor, only to inhale this scent and forget what he was stressed about in the first place. As you continue through the perfumed garden, the scents begin blending into something softer, something almost abstract. You notice small clay dishes placed here and there on stone plinths. Each dish contains resin or incense, frankincense, myrrh, maybe even storax, slowly smoldering and releasing fragrant threads into the air. The smoke drifts upward, pale and delicate, like thoughts escaping the mind before words can catch them. You watch one ribbon of smoke twist itself into a thin spiral before dissolving quietly into the night. The ground beneath your feet changes from stone to fine gravel, crunching softly with each step. The sound is so gentle it almost blends with your breathing. The garden narrows into a corridor of tall, slender cypress trees that rise like dark green columns on either side of you. Their scent is subtle but unmistakable, dry, solemn, slightly resinous. The Romans associated cypress with the boundary between life and afterlife, but here it feels more like a symbol of calm permanence, a reminder that some things simply stand, quietly, without demanding your attention. At the end of the cypress corridor, the garden opens once more into a small circular clearing. A single stone bench sits in the center, illuminated by lamplight. You sit because the space feels designed for that exact purpose. The scents swirl together here: rose, mint, lavender, citrus, incense, laurel, and somehow none of them overpower the others. They rest together in the air like a well-rehearsed chorus, each voice clear but harmonious. You breathe slowly, you settle, you feel the garden exhale with you. And somewhere, faintly, you begin to understand why emperors built secret places like this. Not for power, not for display, but for the simple luxury of feeling the world grow quiet around them. You move onward from the perfumed sanctuary, leaving behind the last drifting ribbons of incense as they curl upward and disappear into the night. The path becomes wider here, broader than anything you've walked so far, as though the emperor intended this next space to feel grand. Not imposing, he already had entire palaces for that, but grand in a softer, more contemplative way. The gravel shifts to smooth marble beneath your feet, cool and faintly luminous in the lamplight. And you realize you're entering what must be the astronomer's walk, a long, open-air promenade built for wandering under the Roman sky. You might expect a story about gardens to stay close to the earth, but this emperor, it seems, also liked to look upward. Maybe all rulers do. Maybe it's easy to feel the edge of your own smallness when you stare at something that can't be taxed or conquered, or politely bribed into obedience. And so you walk, the night open and vast above you. The promenade begins simply, with two parallel rows of low stone pedestals stretching into the distance. On each pedestal sits a bronze instrument, armillary spheres, gnomons, calibrated discs etched with delicate markings. You run your fingers along the cool metal, tracing circles within circles, the Roman attempt to grasp the movements of the heavens. The craftsmanship is absurdly precise. Someone spent months inscribing mathematical perfection into these little orbits. You can almost picture him hunched over his workbench, muttering about stars that refuse to stay put. As you walk farther, the pedestals grow more elaborate. One holds a massive ring of bronze mounted on a tilting axis. You lean in and notice tiny inscriptions, dates, angles, predictions of solstices and equinoxes. Another contains what looks like an enormous bowl of polished stone with markings cut into its rim. You recognize it as a kind of star map, an ancient attempt to bring the sky down onto a surface you can touch. You trail your hand through the shallow bowl, almost expecting the constellations to ripple like water. The air shifts as you continue. It becomes colder, lighter, cleaner, like the atmosphere itself thins out for a moment. The path widens again, opening into a circular terrace. You step onto it, and your breath catches a little. Above you, the sky stretches in all directions, unobstructed by trees or buildings. It feels like standing inside an upturned bowl of midnight. The stars are startlingly clear here, almost sharp. You tilt your head back, and there they are, wheeling slowly, patiently, as they have for every emperor, every citizen, every wandering human who ever looked up and wondered. In the center of the terrace stands a large, low platform made of white marble, polished so smooth it reflects the sky like a second heavens. You step onto it carefully, and the effect is immediate. The stars seem to surround you, above and below, as if you're floating in the quietest, calmest corner of the universe. You breathe out slowly, your shoulders loosen without you meaning to. This must have been intentional. You can almost feel the Emperor pacing this platform centuries ago, hands clasped behind his back, pretending for a moment that he could step directly into the sky if he wanted. To your right sits a bronze table with a shallow groove carved into its surface. You study it. It's a sundial, but not quite. This one seems designed for nighttime, calibrated for moonlight instead of sun. The Romans were clever like that. Why stop timekeeping just because the day ends? You imagine some patient astronomer sitting beside it at night, squinting at faint lunar shadows while everyone else sensibly slept. To your left is a small stone bench, curved to match the terrace's circular shape. You sit, because this place practically commands it. The marble is cold, but the night air feels warm enough that you settle easily. Around you the gentle hum of nocturnal life whispers, crickets in the distance, leaves rustling softly, a faint breeze that brushes the side of your face like a polite greeting. You gaze upward again, letting your eyes trace constellations the way ancient Romans once did. You can picture their stories, the hunter, the twins, the lion, all shimmering quietly above the emperor's private walkway. Storytelling has always been a human attempt to domesticate the sky, to make its vastness feel less overwhelming. You find comfort in that thought. As the minutes pass, the sky seems to grow deeper, darker, more velvety. You feel yourself slow down internally, like a machine easing into its lowest setting. The Emperor's garden is doing its job. You're still learning, still observing, but you're also drifting ever so slightly into that soft mental space where thoughts stretch out and breathe. You rise from the bench and walk the final few steps to the terrace's edge. The drop below isn't steep, it slopes gently toward another pathway, but from this height, the view across the gardens feels enormous. You see glimmers of lamplight reflecting on distant pools, faint silhouettes of cypress and pine, and the far-off suggestion of structures you haven't reached yet. Everything feels connected, purposeful, arranged not as a show of wealth but as a slow, unfolding experience. You take one last look at the sky, still sprawling, irresistible, and then you step off the terrace, ready to see where the Emperor's secret world leads next. You descend from the astronomer's walk along a sloping path lined with pale limestone blocks, each one glowing faintly in the moonlight as though soaked in centuries of stored starlight. The air becomes warmer again, carrying with it a faint, comforting aroma, something woody, something earthy, something that reminds you vaguely of smoke without actually being smoke. You're heading into a more grounded part of the Emperor's hidden world now, literally and figuratively. The sky has had its moment, now it's time to return to the earth. The path leads you into what appears at first to be a humble grove. But the Romans didn't create humble spaces for their emperors, even secretly. As you step inside, you realize that this is the garden of ancient trees, a place devoted entirely to the oldest, most venerable plants the emperor could acquire, or in some cases, uproot from their original homes and transport here at incredible expense. You're walking among giants. The first trees you notice are the olives. Their trunks twist like ropes made of living stone, thick and gnarled, their bark textured in soft ridges that catch the lamplight in warm, muted patterns. These trees look more like sculptures than plants, ancient figures frozen mid-motion. Some of them might be older than the emperor himself, older than the empire even, watching centuries pass with the bored, slow-moving patience of organisms that measure time in centuries rather than seasons. You place a hand on one trunk. It is cool, solid, completely unconcerned with your existence. It's strangely comforting. A little farther in, you find the oaks, huge, spreading, muscular things with branches thicker than pillars and leaves that whisper together above you like an audience exchanging sleepy commentary. Oak has always symbolized strength and continuity, but here it feels almost like companionship. You walk between their trunks and feel, for a moment, like a very small but welcome guest in a hall built by nature. As the path curves, you arrive at a cluster of cypress trees. You've already met cypress earlier in the perfumed garden, but these are older, taller, darker. They rise in narrow spires, reaching straight upward like green flares carved out of shadow. Their presence is solemn but not frightening. They make you think about how time passes and doesn't pass, how life stretches upward even when everything else feels like it's closing in. The air is cooler around them, you breathe it in slowly. You continue walking, and the grove transitions into something more curated, a deliberately arranged set of terraces where the emperor kept specimens from across the empire and beyond. You recognize a massive plane tree, its bark peeling in soft patches like a lazy snake shedding its skin. You see a fig tree, whose leaves are broad enough to shade half your torso if you held one over your head. You see laurels again, older, rougher, less polished than the ones in the perfumed garden. And they smell subtly different, more resinous, almost smoky. One terrace features trees imported from far-off provinces, cedars from Lebanon, hardy desert acacias, even a tamarisk with feathery branches that sway gently in the breeze. It's like a botanical map of everything Rome once reached, displayed here in miniature, as though the emperor liked to remind himself that the world was large and he could bring pieces of it home whenever he wished. Eventually you reach a clearing where the trees give way to a broad wooden platform built around the largest and oldest tree in the entire collection, a behemoth with a trunk so immense that it would take 10 people holding hands to circle it. The bark is cracked, dark, ancient. You have no idea what species it is at first, and that mystery feels appropriate. It stands like the centerpiece of time itself, a living timeline older than every stone in the villa. A bench curves around one side of the platform. You sit, because how could you not? The breeze stirs the canopy above you, creating a soft rustling that falls in long, slow waves, like distant applause for the tree simply existing. You lean back slightly, letting your shoulders settle, and you notice something carved into the bench. A set of tiny grooves arranged in a pattern you don't recognize. Perhaps they're marks made by the emperor himself, absent-mindedly scratching thoughts into wood during long nights of contemplation. You close your eyes for a moment, listening. The grove breathes, leaves shift, branches creak, something small scurries across the undergrowth. It feels like sitting in an ancient temple that worships time, patience, and slow, steady growth. You feel yourself soften again, your thoughts elongating the way they tend to in peaceful places. When you stand and begin walking again, the path leads you out of the grove gradually. The trees grow smaller, younger, more familiar. The air warms, the sense of ancient weight begins to lift. By the time you reach the edge of the garden, you feel oddly renewed, not energized exactly, but steadied, the way one feels after speaking with someone very old who doesn't need to explain anything to be understood. Ahead of you lies the next part of the Emperor's secret world, waiting quietly. You follow a narrow path that curves gently away from the ancient grove, and the atmosphere shifts almost immediately. The air grows warmer still, tinged with the faint sweetness of baked earth. You detect something else too, something mineral, something metallic. A soft hiss reaches your ears, then a faint bubbling sound. It doesn't take long for you to realize what comes next. The Emperor's private thermal springs, a secluded bathing complex tucked deep within the garden, far removed from the bustling public baths of Rome. The Romans loved baths the way modern people love warm, cozy blankets, and the emperor, naturally, loved them even more. He built this hidden bathing sanctuary, not for public display, not for socializing, not for arguing about politics, though Romans could argue anywhere, but simply for the pleasure of sinking into warm water where no one could bother him. The path widens into a stone terrace overlooking a natural spring that feeds a series of interconnected pools. The water glows faintly under the torchlight, the surface shimmering with a soft golden tint. Mineral-rich steam curls into the air like warm, sleepy breath. The ground beneath your feet vibrates subtly, as though the earth itself is purring. You approach the first pool, shallow, warm, and edged with smooth stone worn soft by years of use. You dip your fingers in. The water is the perfect temperature, warm enough to relax you instantly, but not so hot that it shocks your system. You can see why emperors valued these places. It's not luxury so much as surrender. The water invites you to let go. To your left is a deeper pool, fed by a narrow channel where water flows steadily from a small rock formation. Tiny minerals sparkle in the current like dust caught in sunlight. A carved inscription on the stone beside it explains, very matter-of-factly, that this spring was believed to have healing properties. Of course it was. Every spring in Rome claimed to have healing properties, but here, in this quiet, secluded place, the idea actually feels believable. You continue walking, and reach a circular pool half surrounded by a low colonnade. Marble pillars rise around you like the ribs of a giant ancient creature. The water here is cooler, fed from an underground source. You can hear the faint echo of droplets falling inside the hollow spaces beneath the stone. It's soothing in a more introspective way, a coolness that clears the mind rather than relaxing the body. A little farther along, you find a small chamber partially built into the hillside. Warm vapor pours from the entrance. You step inside and discover a miniature steam room, engineered with such precision that you can still feel the Roman genius behind every carved channel and vent. The steam wraps around you, gentle and enveloping, like a warm cloud. You breathe slowly, your muscles loosen, your thoughts drift. It is almost too easy to imagine the emperor sitting on that stone bench centuries ago, the same warm mist curling around him as he planned, or daydreamed, or simply existed. You leave the chamber and follow another path to the final pool, a wide, quiet basin edged in polished basalt. This pool is different. The water is perfectly still, without a single ripple. The surface reflects the sky so cleanly that for a moment you feel as though you're standing at the edge of a hole cut directly into the heavens. You kneel and place a hand just above the surface, watching your fingertips hover over the reflected stars. A faint breeze moves through the springs, stirring the torches and carrying warmth across your skin. You inhale deeply. The air tastes mineral-rich and comforting, like something that has risen from deep within the earth simply to soothe whoever finds it. You walk slowly around the basin, noticing the small details, the perfectly placed stepping stones, the shallow channels that control flow, the carved symbols marking each pool's purpose. Nothing here is accidental. Everything is arranged to guide a person gently from warmth to coolness, from heaviness to lightness, from thought to nothing at all. By the time you reach the far side of the springs, your whole body feels slower, calmer, almost too relaxed to keep moving. But the gardens continue, and somewhere in the night, another part of the emperor's hidden world waits to be discovered. You leave the warmth of the thermal springs with your skin still tingling faintly, as though the water has marked you in some quiet, lingering way. The night air greets you gently, cool but not cold, soft enough that it settles over you like the thinnest cloak. The path ahead is narrow again, winding through a low corridor of shrubs whose leaves whisper as you brush past. You can tell you're approaching another themed corner of the emperor's secret world, and the air changes before the scenery does. It grows sharper, brighter somehow, carrying the faint metallic scent of worked stone. There's a sense of craftsmanship here, of deliberate design, and when you step into the next clearing, you understand why. You have entered the Garden of Instruments, though garden might be the wrong word. This feels more like an outdoor workshop, Roman engineering dressed up as art. The emperor, it seems, was not content with beauty alone. He wanted demonstration, innovation, a reminder that Rome's power wasn't just military or political, it was intellectual. And so this space is a display of devices, mechanisms, and curiosities that hover somewhere between sculpture and machinery. The first thing you notice is a tall, narrow tower of stone rising in the center. At first it looks purely decorative, but then you see the bronze arm mounted near the top and the chain that disappears into the ground. Beneath it sits a stone basin. A faint drip echoes from above, slow and rhythmic. You lean closer and realize this is a clepsydra, a water clock. The bronze arm tilts gradually as drops accumulate, marking time not with sound but with subtle movement. Water clocks were common enough in Rome, but this one is elegant, refined, its mechanics exposed so you can see the process instead of merely trusting it. Time made visible, time made gentle. To the left is a sundial, of course, but not the usual flat disc. This one curves upward into a half-sphere carved with delicate lines representing hours, seasons, and celestial paths. When sunlight hits it, the shadows must trace shapes across the surface like a slow-moving constellation. At night it serves another purpose entirely. Its polished surface reflects lamplight in soft arcs, turning the dial into a glowing bowl. You run your fingers across the markings. They feel smooth, worn, touched by many curious hands before your own. A little farther along, you come across what looks like a simple bench until you see the series of bronze rods built into its underside, each a different length, each finely tuned. You tap one gently. A low, resonant tone hums through the garden, vibrating through your fingertips. A Roman tuning bench, perhaps. A musician might sit here, testing intervals under the night sky. Or perhaps the emperor simply enjoyed the small pleasure of sitting somewhere that made music whenever he shifted his weight. You try tapping another rod. The tone is higher, clearer, as if the garden briefly found its voice. Near the bench stands a stone pillar with a hollow center and carved channels spiraling downward. It's a sound funnel, designed to carry faint noises from a distance and amplify them. You lean toward it, listening. You hear the soft murmur of water from the springs behind you, carried neatly down the carved channels into your ear like a secret whispered through time. Ingenious, quiet, absolutely unnecessary, and absolutely delightful. On the opposite side of the clearing, you find an array of small bronze sculptures arranged in a semicircle, each shaped like an animal: bird, hare, fox, wolf. Their mouths are open, and you notice tiny holes drilled at precise angles. When the wind passes through the clearing, each one produces a different tone. You stand still for a moment and wait. The breeze comes, gentle but steady, and the sculptures sing, a soft chorus of whistles, chirps, and airy notes. The sound is faint enough that you have to lean in slightly, as though the garden is telling a story meant only for attentive listeners. Farther in, the instruments grow more complex. You find a device powered by flowing water that turns a set of gears, which in turn spin a bronze disc etched with geometric patterns. When it rotates, the reflections dance across the surrounding stone walls in shifting shapes: triangles, circles, spirals. It's not exactly practical, but then again beauty very rarely needs to be. You watch the shapes flicker across the ground, following them with your eyes the way one might watch flames in a fireplace. Toward the back of the clearing is a structure half hidden by ivy. You push the leaves aside and discover a small alcove housing a simple apparatus. A beam balanced on a fulcrum, weighted at one end, adjustable at the other. A balance scale, but larger, almost ceremonial. Someone could stand on one side and counterweight themselves on the other. You step onto the platform. It shifts slightly beneath your weight, rising just enough to make you feel momentarily suspended. Not floating, just lightly untethered. You step off again, feeling oddly refreshed. The final device is the simplest. A polished bronze mirror set within a frame of carved vines. It reflects you with startling clarity, lit by the soft glow of nearby lamps. But behind your reflection you can see the devices, the sculptures, the gears turning slowly in the lamplight. You see time, sound, motion, all gently coexisting behind your shoulder. It feels like standing at the center of Roman curiosity itself, a reminder that even ancient empires had their quiet corners of invention. You walk out of the clearing feeling lighter. Peering into the past can sometimes feel heavy, but here it's gentle. Human, sleepy, even. The Emperor's mechanical garden hums behind you as you head toward whatever comes next. The path leads you away from the mechanical garden and toward a part of the villa grounds where the night air takes on a different quality, still calm, still soft, but infused with a faint sweetness that is unmistakably botanical. You recognize it before you see the source. Crushed leaves, pollen, the dusty scent of drying petals. You've arrived at the Emperor's archive of living plants, though archive is a polite way of saying this is where he kept the plants too valuable, or too strange, to leave to chance. The space opens into a sprawling arrangement of low terraces, each one devoted to a different collection. Torches glow at regular intervals, casting steady pools of amber light across the foliage. You step into the first terrace and find yourself surrounded by medicinal herbs. They grow in meticulous rows, each species separated by thin stone dividers: lavender, rosemary, sage, mint. It smells like a Roman apothecary had an enthusiastic outburst. The scents mingle gently in the air, calming without trying. You brush your hand across a row of chamomile, and the tiny blossoms release a sleepy aroma that drifts upward like a soft sigh. Further along, the herbs give way to plants with more dramatic personalities. Tall stalks of fennel, broad mustard leaves, pungent garlic shoots. These were practical plants, relied upon by cooks and healers alike. But the emperor wasn't collecting them for kitchen use. He liked knowing that every remedy, every flavor, every possibility existed within reach. You picture him walking through here at dawn, brushing dew off the leaves as he made mental notes no one dared question. A stone staircase leads to the next terrace, and something changes the moment you step onto it. The air is thicker, sweeter, heavier, almost syrupy with fragrance. You're surrounded by flowers now, not the decorative blooms from the perfumed garden earlier, but exotic species collected from the far reaches of the empire. There are lilies the size of your hand with petals streaked in gold. There are dark red blossoms that smell faintly of spice. There are tiny white flowers that release their scent only at night, creating a soft sweetness that hangs in the air like a candle blown out moments ago. You breathe deeply, the scent lingers, it settles somewhere behind your eyes, loosening something you didn't realize was tight. Toward the center of this terrace sits a small pavilion made of white marble and open on all sides. Inside, the emperor kept what his gardeners called the travelers, plants too delicate to survive outdoors year-round. Clay pots line the shelves, ferns from humid forests, strange succulents from desert provinces, orchids with petals like watercolor strokes. Each pot is labeled in tiny, neat handwriting, probably a scribe's work. You lean closer to one orchid whose petals curve like little crescent moons. It looks impossibly fragile, yet it sits here thriving in its imperial sanctuary. The third terrace holds the real treasures, plants used for dyes, perfumes, rare medicines. You find clusters of saffron crocuses, their delicate purple petals spread open like tiny stars. Resin-rich myrrh shrubs grow nearby, their branches giving off a faint, earthy sweetness. You kneel to examine a plant whose roots were once worth their weight in silver. Its leaves are small, plain, almost unimpressive, like most things humans decide to make valuable. You run your fingertips along the smooth surface of a carved stone marker beside it, reading a note about its potency. Someone took great care here. The path brings you to a fourth terrace, smaller, quieter, dimmer. You instantly feel the difference. These plants aren't meant for fragrance or medicine, they're sacred. Laurel, used to crown poets and generals, olive saplings descended from ancient groves. A single oak sapling said to be grown from a seed taken from a battlefield long forgotten. You stand quietly, letting the air settle around you. The garden feels older here, even though these plants are young. It feels like memory taking root. At the far end of the terrace stands a simple wooden table with a set of wax tablets. You flip one open. Pressed into the wax are faint imprints of leaves, studies of shape, vein patterns, edges. A botanical diary. You close the tablet gently, struck by the intimacy of it. Someone centuries ago held a leaf in their hand and pressed it here, preserving the moment. You smile at the thought. As you head toward the final terrace, the air changes once again. It grows cooler, drier. You step into a space enclosed by low walls and find yourself in the seed vault. A collection of clay jars sealed with wax, each labeled, each containing seeds from every plant the emperor wanted preserved. It's oddly moving, the idea of storing the future in tiny, silent containers. You pick one up, it's warm from the torchlight. Inside you can hear nothing, feel nothing, but you know there is life waiting in there, patient, resilient, timeless. When you leave the archive, your mind feels unusually soft around the edges, as if the greenery has soaked into your thoughts. The Emperor's garden has many moods, and tonight it has shown you its gentlest, the part that keeps things safe, growing, blooming quietly in the dark. Ahead, the path leads into shadow. You follow it, ready for the next secret. The path opens gently, without fanfare, into a secluded garden so peaceful it feels like stumbling into the Emperor's unspoken thoughts. Everything here is lower, softer, quieter. You instinctively lower your own shoulders, as if matching the rhythm of the space. Even the breeze behaves differently here, sliding rather than blowing, drifting rather than pushing. At the center is a long rectangular pool, not grand like the fountains before, but serene, edged with moss-covered stones that look intentionally worn. Water lilies float across the surface, their pale petals glowing faintly in lamplight. Their reflections hover beneath them like ghost versions, gently trembling with every small ripple. You walk along the edge of the pool, each step slow and respectful, because this doesn't feel like a place you rush. On the far